being like, are you guys ready yet? Okay, I think we're live. Good morning, everyone. It's so nice to be with you guys in the church. It's also good to have Shamanta back from India, and to have new faces and old. But today we're going to discuss a recent respond to and discuss this article that was in the New York Times. It's an opinion piece in the New York Times by Ross Douthat, who is, I think, considered a conservative thinker.
Yeah, libertarian conservative.
Libertarian conservative. The article, the opinion piece was titled "Donald Trump, Man of Destiny," and so Doc's going to lead a discussion on Man of Destiny, Hegel's understanding Man of Destiny, and where we disagree or what we would say. And then after we have a discussion on that opinion piece and also a little bit about the Democratic Party in crisis, Jeremiah will lead a discussion on Oren Cass, who I think is considered a conservative.
Oren Cass and J.D. Vance.
And then after those discussions, like always, we'll do an update on our upcoming August 2nd, 3rd, and 5th event, celebrating James Baldwin's 100th birthday. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Montero.
Thank you, Dr. Don.
Not yet, I wish.
Good morning, everybody. We're going to talk about this essay and his reference to Hegel's Man of Destiny. But before we get there, I made a couple of mistakes, I think, last week. I just want to correct them. I referred to Edward Bernstein as Karl Bernstein. There's so much going on in your head. The man, the social democrat of the 1890s, his name is Edward Bernstein, the social democrat and the man who put forward the theory as capitalism develops and further modernizes the class struggle or the conflicts in society lessen. And therefore, I was saying that theory drives the current thinking, even though they might not know Bernstein, of most trade union leaders, and hence their attachment to the Democratic Party. The other mistake I made, and where I was talking about the three component parts of Marxism, you remember that? And I attributed it to Frederick Engels. Actually, the essay is three sources and three component parts of Marxism written by Lenin. And again, moving so quickly sometimes. I was thinking about the book by Engels entitled Anti-Düring, where he tries to flesh out the foundations of Marx's theory. So I just wanted to correct that for the record. The other thing is just a few reflections upon the political crisis in the country. Since we were here last week, Trump was almost assassinated, and the Republican Party completed its convention, and the chaos and internal conflict of the Democratic Party has only deepened. The sides have now come out in the open, and this wasn't the case last week. The Obama faction, the Pelosi faction, the forces supporting Biden, and who knows who else. The Bernie Sanders AOC faction, the so-called progressives or social democrats, as it were, in the Democratic Party, all of these factions are going at each other. It's almost a mutual suicide pact. It's, as I understand, it is the way scorpions fight, where at the end neither survives. The one who wins dies, and the one that he kills dies. And the scorpions fight to the death. It's a form of mutually assured destruction. It is, I guess I said this, a suicide pact, even though all sides don't see it that way. Nothing good will come out of this in terms of the Democratic Party. Uh, this internal struggle literally guarantees a Trump landslide, both in the Electoral College and for the first time, probably since 2004 election, the Republicans will win the popular vote. Now, I say Republican advisedly, because the party that has now emerged is not, and of course, Jerry will further analyze in detail this. The party that has emerged is not a Republican Party. A Republican Party would be a party of people like Mitch McConnell and those, what's his name from South Carolina?
Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham.
Lindsey Graham, Marco Rubio. That is the Republican Party that emerges after the 1970s, the party that literally became the white man's party, as it were. And by the way, was committed for the most part not to winning in presidential elections a popular mandate, a popular majority, or 51% majority, but being a minority that could win the Electoral College. What we saw coming out of the convention and the rise of Trump, and it was a meteoric rise. He was not supposed to be here. And it's so interesting. We've been discussing this for at least 7, 8 months, have we not? And when Trump came out, not down the escalator at his condominium in New York, but on the stump, saying this will be a movement, and I will be your avenger. And he was playing this song from the Broadway play Les Miserables, which is not insignificant and will relate to what I'm going to say today, because Victor Hugo was a central player at the time that Marx wrote his rejoinder to Hegel, but we'll get into all that in a minute. And that's when we came up with the RFK, Donald Trump, Cornel West, a triad of opposition, but that didn't work out, as Jerry reminds me. It was a possibility, but nonetheless, Trump rose. It was not supposed to happen. It was not supposed to happen. And the neocons and the neoliberals threw everything but the kitchen sink at him. So we will come back to that. But the thing now is the Democratic Party. And let us be real. This is not the Democratic Party of Franklin D. Roosevelt. It is not the Democratic Party that entered into a social contract with the working class, with Black folk, ultimately with women. It is not that Democratic Party, although it tries to keep that image. It is a party of intersectionality. It is, this is very important. The working class has completely left the Democratic Party. It's hard for me to describe, because I forget some things that I want to say. But when I was coming up, and like you all's ages, it was a given. The Democratic Party bends towards working people, towards civil rights, ultimately women's rights, and so on. The rich man's party was the Republican Party, the country club, the business roundtable, the Chamber of Commerce. But by the 1990s, and really with Bill Clinton, a fundamental shift what they call triangulation, that to win against the Republicans, they had to become Republican or Republican light, while still claiming to represent working people and black folk, and of course the blackness leadership or the black political class and the labor leaders provided a shield, a veil. You get nothing from them while you still claim they're doing everything for you. And we'll come back to that when we talk about tragedy and farce. But it ceased being that. It is now made up of the richest people in the world. It is a party. If you measure income, there is no party in the world ever in history that has been made up of such wealth and high income and highly educated people. It is the party of the managerial elites, of the college professors, of the journalists, of those in the most elite professions, while the Republican Party has become the party of working people. The working classes in the Republican Party. So we've had, in these last 20 years, 30 years, an absolute reversal. But in foreign policy, and we talked about this and received the wrath of the quote left, which is also in collapse in the face of this. It is the party that advocates for the elite, and they took it too far. You know, one's attitude towards his or her gender or sexuality is their position. But you cannot take that to be the new civil rights. And if you are not down with, everything that this LGBTQ movement says, then you're a bigot, you're a homophobe, you're this, that, and the other. But let's be real. Most people who are LGBT, well, I don't even want to use that because that's a title, in order to make it appear to be a movement that it is not. But if you go into the working class, if you go among Black people, they have a gay, straight, or whatever. Their attitude towards the LGBTQ movement is contempt. Just like you get the pride parades in Philly or New York or wherever, well, you can count on one hand the numbers of Black folk you see. And here in Philadelphia. So it is a white movement to defend whiteness. I remember the great article written by Michelle some years ago. What was the title of that article, Michelle? If you don't mind me asking.
Queerness is whiteness.
Say that again.
Queerness as whiteness.
Queerness is whiteness. And it is. It is another default to whiteness, because then the queer question is on the level of the Black question. And so you ask yourself, well, this is Baldwin's 100th anniversary. There have been marches for gay pride. I don't see gay people marching or holding seminars or classes on Baldwin. Why? Party of American Empire. And it is that. And we were right all the time in the free school in seeing that and 2016 to where we are today. But there was, as well, as Marx called it, a rational kernel in the Trump movement.
Right.
And that is what we were trying to understand. And we, and I give all y'all a lot of credit for this. We, as Malcolm X said, we were not took, we were not had, and we were not bamboozled. We saw a fraud and called it out and stood our ground. And that's something that we should all be proud of, that we held the line. You know what I'm saying? And like I said to my friend Jerry, whom I talk to every day, I'm now prepared to take my victory lap backwards. Look at that. But, and there was a lot of abuse. I mean, I know personally I suffered a lot of it, but I'm a Scorpio, so. I hate to say it. It's not one of my redeeming qualities. I might forgive, but I don't forget. I don't, and I can't, You do me wrong, you will find, but anyway. I've just exposed my dark side. But, the abuse on WURD, and being cut off, and, all that kind of, a lot of things. We won't go into everything. But since we did not go along with the dominant line of the ruling class, of the war makers, of the neocons, of the neoliberals, something was wrong with us. Because, like in her article, like when we talk about the left and the AOCs and the Bernies and all of these people, their default is whiteness. In some ways, the question is, for us now, Baldwin or the abyss? Baldwin or whiteness? And that's where we are. Whiteness and democracy are incompatible. And whiteness in all of its multivariant forms remains whiteness. Hence, when we talked about Judith Butler and that framing of gender and sexuality, for whom? Whose interests are you serving? Or I remember, and I don't want to bring this up too much, when we were celebrating King's April 4th speech, and we invited a woman from Jewish Voices for Peace, and she could barely enunciate a sentence before she was counterposing Audre Lorde to Jimmy Baldwin. By the way, which I felt was a very disrespectful act. And if I ever see her, I'm going to tell her to her face, you disrespected us and what we were doing. And I know what you were doing. It was to disrespect and undermine. And I think this has to be also established as we go forward. There is a line of respect that you don't cross with us. And that was to disrespect us. And we invited her because of our respect for Jewish Voices for Peace and those Jewish people who were standing up against the Israeli Nazi regime. Anyway, now the whole house of cards is collapsing in upon itself. Where do they go from here? Well, they're trying to get Biden out of it, and they can't. He's holding on like a pit bull. You know what I'm saying? Pit bull gets a hold of you, they don't let go. They can't get him loose, man. And then his wife, his son Hunter, who I believe is still on the pipe, at least in recovery from the pipe. And see, the pipe is a hell of a thing. People don't understand the pipe. Don't know what I'm talking about when I say the pipe, right? Crack. You know, the only thing that outdoes the pipe is fentanyl. You know what I'm saying? So the pipe is rough, but and then his Biden's sister, his brother, and a few of his hardcore supporters, and they held up now in Delaware, Rehoboth, at his beach compound. Now they're saying he's going to give up by this weekend, but it's not guaranteed. He's mad at Obama, he's mad at the Clintons, he's mad at Pelosi, he's mad at everybody who he believes and his family believes have stabbed him in the back. And they have. But at hometown, you done stabbed a lot of people in the back in your day. So what goes around comes around. You reap what you sow. But the suicide pact, it's hard to understand. Are there, they always talk about who are the adults in the room? Who are the reasonable people? There are no adults in the room. Even from their own interests, Biden can't beat Trump. Okay? But yet, it seems like Biden and the others are in this suicide pact where they will take both sides down. And the emotional level is just at that, high peak right now. We've never seen it. Trump led a movement that took over a party. Abraham Lincoln led a movement that created a party in the 1850s. So movements, but there is no movement undergirding the Democratic Party because they have utter contempt for the people. Oh, and this is where Black people are so alienated. You keep telling us to come out to vote and what you're going to do and all this, and nothing ever is done. Things get worse. The working class says the same thing. Now, you say, well, if Biden pulls out, then what do they do? Well, the easiest thing would be for him to anoint Kamala Harris. Okay? That would be the easiest thing. Now, you get people talking about, well, we should have mini conventions in various parts of the country where people vote on who they want to raise their hand. How that works. Others have said we should have an open convention where Biden releases all of his delegates and they're free to vote for whomever, Another scheme that's been talked about is, well, they give the nomination to Kamala Harris, and dig this move, and then she chooses Barack Obama to be her vice president. You're talking about Hail Mary. You know the Hail Mary practice. This is the Hail Mary of all Hail Marys of history. That she chooses Barack Obama. And then after 9 months or a year in office, if they can win, then she resigns and let him become. Okay. This is desperate, just desperation. Or maybe Kamala Harris will choose Gavin Newsom, or the governor of Pennsylvania, which I think would be a disaster, because they need Pennsylvania. Yeah. Then I read the polls every day, Real Clear Politics is worth going. Do you go to?
Yeah.
Every day I look, see what's going on. Not only is Trump leading in all of the national polls, but in the polls of all of the swing states. And now the electoral map has been widened. Nevada, New Hampshire, Virginia. These were supposed to be secure blue states, democratic states,
Mm.
you know? And now some people even talking about New York.
Yeah.
I mean, this would be a catastrophe politically.
Mm.
The whole Democratic Party would be brought to its knees. I'm not unhappy about that, by the way. You know, you reap what you sow.
Right.
The arrogance, the hubris, the war policies. Okay, I just wanted to say that.
Yeah.
Now, in the wake of all of this, and if you want to, if you just type in Donald Trump, man of destiny, you can pull it up on your phone. It's by a man named Ross Duda.
Are you sure it's not do that?
Well, I'm using the black fit. Do that, do that, do that. What is it? It's do that or do that? Do that.
Or do that?
Do thought might be my guess.
What did you say?
Do thought.
Do that. Okay.
Do that.
But it looks like do that or do that. But anyway, it's one of the strangest names.
I agree.
He should do like they do in the black community, take on a Muslim name. Convert. But anyway, he is a regular opinion columnist for the New York Times and a man with considerable intellectual capacity. These are not uh, uh, people that should be taken lightly. They are at the height, the peak of the bourgeois intelligentsia. In a lot of ways, these are the real public intellectuals. And Nuri sent me this essay from the New York Times, and thank you, Nuri. And I read it, and I was very impressed, and it set off my thinking, and I'll tell you how. But if you don't mind, I'll just, if you guys can find it, it's worth you can read along. I just want to read a part of it here. I'll start at the paragraph that begins, having lived through 8 years of that era, the Trump era, though, I feel comfortable making one sweeping statement about the moments when Trump shifted his head fractionally and literally dodged a bullet, fell bleeding, and then rose with his fists raised in an iconic image of defiance. The scene on Saturday night in Pennsylvania was the ultimate confirmation of his status as a man of destiny, a character out of Hegel or Thomas Carlyle or some other verbose 19th century philosopher of history, a figure touched by the gods of fortune in a way that transcends the normal rules of politics. In Hegel's work, the great man of history is understood as a figure, quote, whose own particular aims involve those larger issues, which are the will of the world spirit. Hegel's paradigm was Napoleon, the Corsican adventurer whose quest for personal power and military glory spread the ideas of the French Revolution, shattered the old regimes of Europe, and ushered in the modern age. Let me just say parenthetically, Hegel was a philosopher of history, but he saw history as always moving forward. In that sense, the idea of progress is a modern concept. It is a concept that arises with the bourgeois revolutions, liberalism, reason, science, law, all of this. And so when reading Hegel or any of these thinkers, Kant, what you're reading are ideologues of the bourgeoisie, but of progress. Progress is a modern concept. Okay? Again, staying within the parentheses. That is why it is often difficult to find the point of intersection, I'll put it that way, of traditional civilizational values and progress. China struggles with it, India struggles with it. In some ways, we don't have to struggle with it here in the United States because of the newness of the country. But again, Hegel is a philosopher of progress. Kant is a philosopher of progress. Both of them supported the French Revolution and the most revolutionary left-wing elements of it. That is, the Robespierres, the communards, communists, the most revolutionary wing of the French Revolution. Hegel supported the Haitian Revolution and Toussaint Louverture. And I think Hegel may have referred to Toussaint as a man of destiny who represented the spirit of the age, the spirit of the time. I'll close that parentheses. Okay. Modern age, okay. For Hegel, the great man's role is a fundamentally progressive one. He is developing or revealing some heretofore hidden truth, pushing civilization towards its next stage of development, sometimes committing crimes or trampling sacred things, but always in service to a higher aim, the unfolding intentions of a divine process, of a world spirit. In different ways in my own lifetime, American conservatism and liberalism placed Hegelian hopes in Ronald Reagan and Barack Obama, both figures who seem to embody, the concept embody is very important, a grand optimistic vision of how the global future would unfold. Okay, but then I just like to read the last paragraph. Hold on one second, maybe. Forget. Then he ends, and he says, but to beat him, that is Trump, memo to the Biden Democrats, you have to do more, go further, risk much, become something you yourself did not expect. Because in a struggle with a man of destiny, there is no normalcy to be restored. Now, that is very poetic. In many ways, Hegel's theory of history is a poetic vision. It is more poetry than fact-based. In a sense, it is more similar to Baldwin than to, let us say, modern historiography. The man of destiny is an embodiment of history, of progress. Now, Hegel would say that history always comes in twos, and that as we say in common discourse, history repeats itself. You hear it all the time. For better or worse, history is repeating itself. However, Hegel, in seeing Napoleon as the man of destiny, the man embodying the spirit of the age, the spirit of the age of progress, overlooked certain things. In 1799, 10 years after the French Revolution, Napoleon carried out a coup d'etat against what was then constituted as the French revolutionary state called the Directorate. He overthrew that and declared himself the emperor. About 52 years later, his nephew, named also Bonaparte, but not Napoleon, his name is Louis Bonaparte, overthrows the French government in a bloodless coup and establishes himself as the emperor in the name of Bonaparte. And Marx writes a book entitled The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. Now, the word Brumaire, where did that come from? After the French Revolution, the revolutionaries established a new calendar. And the months of the year were renamed. Brumaire is that part, I think, the fall part of the year. So Brumaire, on the 18th Brumaire, Napoleon overthrew the Directorate, effectively ending the French Revolution, crushing the revolutionaries, parentheses. Victor Hugo's book, Les Miserables, is about a revolutionary who is attempting to restore the French Revolution in the period after Napoleon, and this effort by revolutionaries to restore the revolutionary spirit would ultimately fail, and that by the 1820s, a new form of the monarchy, of the aristocracy or aristocratic rule had been established. But then, as Marx would have it, the class conflict in France became intense. And 1848 is a period where all of Europe was engulfed in an uprising of workers. No place less than in France itself. And so to restore order, Louis Bonaparte establishes a new empire, a new dictatorship in the name of his uncle, Napoleon Bonaparte. And so Marx would respond to Hegel's idea that history comes in twos with, but what Hegel did not understand, that it comes in twos, but first as tragedy, then as farce. This is key. Now, both Marx and Hegel are trying to understand in this, how would you say, almost metaphysical sense, the movement of history. Of course, Hegel would say the movement of history, progress, is the movement of great ideas. Marx would say, well, I'll flip Hegel, that the movement of history is the movement of the class struggle. But whichever way you went, Marx or Hegel, they both have to contend with this idea of history repeating itself or history coming in twos. And so Marx says, first is tragedy, then is farce. Let me explain. For Hegel and for Marx, the man of destiny is so far ahead of his time that society cannot accept him. For example, Martin Luther King, in this construal, is the man of destiny, so far ahead that he must be assassinated. Okay? We could talk about other figures, but let us just use him. And so, to cut short, the progressive movement of history, the powers that be, in a lot of ways, with the complicity of the society, commit an act of assassination. Tragic. 50 years after, Louis Bonaparte rises as a farcical figure, a clown figure, a shallow imitation of at least what Hegel said Napoleon Bonaparte was. Take the African American situation. King has been dead 50 years. He is now presented to younger generation and to society as this empty do-gooder that we honor because he didn't really want to bring about a revolutionary change. We empty him of all of his revolutionary essence. Was a legal. But who do we have in his place? Al Sharpton. A farce. A farcical figure, a clown figure, who is endorsed by the ruling elite of the country and is paid well. And then, of course, you have all these many farcical figures. Martin Luther King, almost like Martin Luther, who he was named after. By the way, just another parenthesis. Martin Luther King was not always Martin Luther King. He was born Michael King Jr. His father was named Michael King Sr. His father went to Germany for some sort of religious conference and kind of went to where Martin Luther had posted these 95 demands on the church door. And as a consequence, changed his name from Michael King Luther King. Thus, Michael King Jr. became Martin Luther King. And that is something that we should think about even more. And Protestantism as a religious movement is from the word protest. Protest against the established religious order. But we'll come back to that. However, in place of the revolutionary liberation theology of Martin Luther King Jr., we get T.D. Jakes and what we call prosperity gospel. It's true if it gets you paid. It's God ordained if it gets you paid. Now the black people didn't start that. That starts in the white church. But it's everywhere, in all the mainline, the Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian, the Unitarians, and we've had our experiences where it's all about the money. But it is from tragedy to farce. Now, do that or do that says that Trump is the man of destiny, the man on the white horse. And I think that do that would have done good if he would have consulted Marx about tragedy and farce. The man of destiny, if you will, was Martin Luther King Jr. Trump is farce. The man of destiny is the champion of progress, of freedom, of emancipation, not of reforming a decadent and dying social order. Okay? So, like they say, don't get it twisted. If one does not understand history, you can mistakenly see the man of destiny or miss who the man of destiny was and how going forward the mandate of history requires a recognition of King, and as we say, as the father of a new nation and a new people, and probably Baldwin as his greatest disciple and articulator going forward, even after King's assassination, of King's vision. And unlike Victor Hugo's Jean Valjean, who fails, King has Baldwin, who lives. Just one couple more things I want to say. In relationship to the interregnum that we are in, and here we're back to Gramsci. As important as Gramsci's consideration of the old dying and the new cannot be born is the period between the old and the new. And this is to Gramsci's credit, that he understood what many current day Marxists or communists do not understand. That you don't just go from the old society and voila to the new. There's a transition. And that in every revolutionary process, there is an interregnum. We are in an interregnum where in order for the new to be born, and King is right, there has to be a revolution of values, a revolution, put it this way, of worldview, an ideological struggle over where the future is. Otherwise, society collapses into decadence and what Marx called the destruction of all classes. I don't know whether I make all the sense in the world. That the new was not born painlessly. There are painful births. How painful? It's hard to say. The ruling elite will not accept a Trump victory. They'll act like they accept it, but then do everything they can to subvert it. And there will be a response to that from the people, from the Trump supporters, and so on. This will either lead to a new level of class conflict, of social conflict, of a pre-revolutionary moment, or it could lead to a civil war moment, or both at the same time, or the ruin of all classes, the collapse of society into decadence and ungovernability. This is why, and I just want to underline, what we are doing is perfectly right. And it doesn't make a difference of who understands it right now.
Yeah.
The dogmas of identity politics. And that's what it is. Dogma. No science. No commitment to progress or to humanity. Complete narcissism. The height of social decadence and collapse. When there is no generosity, no empathy, no concern with the poor. When was the last time that you heard in the gender discourse, poor women, poor trans people, with the emphasis on poor? When did you? No, because there's no empathy. There's no generosity. It represents the decadence of a dying system in this interregnum. The concern is only with the self. It is selfish. And that's what we, discovered about Judith Butler. The quintessential narcissist. And so, all of us must gird ourselves for uncertainty and difficulty. But we must stand on principle. A lot of people get it confused. They confuse dogmatism with principle. To repeat and repeat over and over and over again truths of an earlier period and half-truths of even that period as though they were the truth for now. And I say this not to disrespect anyone, but as a cautionary note. For all of the communists, be they Maga communists, patriot communists, whatever they wish to call themselves, or back to the day communists and all of this, if you stay in that rut, you will miss the train of history. You're too young, most of y'all, to lock yourselves in like that. Yeah, I guess I have to say, as I said, I kind of was in that period. You know what I'm saying? You ain't gonna remake that period. I don't give a damn what you say. That moment achieved what it could in that moment. This is not that time. We have gone to another stage of history. We have. The global movement of humanity will not in this time take the form of the world communist movement, which I've always said was the greatest movement for peace and liberation ever. but we will not go back to that.
Mm.
And dogmatism is a form of intellectual laziness, frankly, of nihilism. Nihilism. I don't care how you try to frame it. And of course, I'll say this, younger people, and it's mainly, from what I see, young men, which raises a point of interrogation.
Mm.
Younger people can often make something that is dead seem to be alive because of the enthusiasm with which they pronounce and celebrate it, But, with all due respect, you need to talk to somebody who was there. You understand? Sometimes you need to be humble. Get all that hubris out of your ass. You're too arrogant. I think King said that about the rule. Because you take on, and really, let's be for real, for real. You act just like the ruling class. It's like, your theme song should be James Brown. It's a man's world. Because it's too, you got to humble yourself. You got to hear something that you're not hearing. You don't know. You understand where I'm coming from? So all of that, we will remake the communist movement. You ain't going to remake nothing. It's not going to be done. And frankly, it does not have to be redone. Hegel was right. Freedom is the recognition of necessity. Freedom is a recognition of, now again, progress. There was no China as we know it today back in the days. There was no China-Russia alliance. We could not even have imagined it. We could not have imagined the undoing of the American political order. We could not have imagined 70% of the American people saying the system needs to be changed or brought down completely. I was back in the days. We could not have, no way. We saw the world movement of socialism and national liberation, third rail being the movements in the advanced capitalist countries, but never the movement in any of the advanced capitalist countries assuming the historic role of the world socialist system and the national liberation movements. Never. Where today, to understand world history, you must factor in a large way the American people. I talked to some barter. He just got back from India. He said, man, we don't know what's going on over here. We're just trying to keep up. And we don't get nothing but from the New York Times. I said, y'all in bad shape over there, dog. But because the center of world historic movement must factor in the American people. Okay? All of this is new. All of this is new. Lenin could not have conceived it. We didn't conceive it, I'm telling you. I know. This moment, and we're fortunate to be alive to see the end of the last great imperialist empire, to watch this collapse, the exhaustion of the ruling class. It's confusion. They pranced on the world stage like they were gods. You understand? We out, we in the grassroots, we rumbling, trying to find a way. oh, they just, we're the gods of the world. Ha, ha, ha. Homie, what you got to say now? Obama, you so cute. You understand? I'm for real. You so, dog, what you got to say now? You going down. Biden? Oh, I know about him. I don't know him, but I saw him. Cold-blooded womanizer. Cold-blooded. They got him on tape recently. Did you? I showed it to.
No, I shouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, when a cat start going into that dementia thing, a lot of their behaviors, they don't have control. So he up there, so this blonde woman, he's all up on the woman, about ready to kiss the woman. His wife run up on the stage and said, man, you need to back up. I mean, really, ran up on the stage. That's what he was. Arrogant. And now, a metaphor of a decadent ruling class. Never could we have conceived it. An awakened people, an angry people, a people that don't want to study war no more. Never had it. I could go into some other things about the theory of the Communist Party, the Leninist Party, how we operated, why we operated that way, what were the assumptions. Those assumptions don't apply now. And I can argue that, debate it with whoever. I think they apply because of an awakened people. Lenin saw a people who were not awakened. The Russian proletariat was not on the level of resistance and anger as the American proletariat is right now. And therefore, a few revolutionaries could seize power as I always said, in the name of the working class. In the name of, and that's part of the theory. We can go back to it. I'll end on this. Baldwin is not a historian. He's an autobiographer. Baldwin does not write history. Hegel didn't write history. He was a philosopher of history. And there's a difference. Baldwin is a biographer of a people, which is deeper than a historian. The method is different. And so I'll end there. We don't know what the immediate future will be, what the Democrats will do, what this circular firing squad will lead to is always mutual disruption. And what will be the day after, not November 5th, but November 6th. Stop there. Forgive me for talking a little too long.
Well, I think both bringing back the Gramsci concept of interregnum, and then now this week with the concept of not just man of destiny, like who is the man of destiny, but tragedy, that there's such thing as tragedy and farce, I think is actually really important. Because in some ways it actually helps us, it gives us a language or a framework to understand both the assassination of King or the Prince of Peace, who is in some ways the path, like there's something very tragic, but in some ways it's a thing that the American people today still have to face, which is the assassination of the Prince of Peace. Like there's the feeling, and like in our reading group where you said there's the feeling, well, there's no peace. But I think the being able to use the language of who is the man of destiny and then tragedy and farce, I think in some ways helps us connect the assassination of King from that moment and then to now, what we see with what's going on, the complete collapse of the Democratic Party in crisis. But then also someone like Trump and a coalition of the discontented, who in some ways can't be so nicely defined just by Trump the man. Like, and I think, because I think what you said about how there is such thing as stages of history, that if you don't recognize that, and if you are unable to even recognize the man of destiny, who still holds, the man of destiny who in some ways was beyond his time and thus did not fit that time and thus had to be assassinated. Because if he was allowed to live, he would in some ways make time real. Like Baldwin would say, is I think the exact thing that the American people today and awakened people have to either, I don't think this is the right term, but pick up or confront, reconcile in order to make something complete. Because in some ways I think, to fulfill the unfulfilled. And no, that's perfect, because I feel like what we're essentially doing is we're using, because Baldwin, like this all comes back to Baldwin. And I love the way you said it, because in some ways I feel like we haven't had the right language, which is, like you said it in a way that Baldwin, he's unlike others, Baldwin as King's greatest disciple, but most importantly, King was killed, but he had Baldwin to live on. Like Baldwin as an articulator of King. Like that's the significance of Baldwin, because something I had said, and I don't know if it's completely right, but in some ways how I saw it when you were talking about tragedy and farce is, another way of saying it is Baldwin keeps the tragedy. Like in some ways he holds on to the tragedy, which in some ways is to continuously define King as the man of destiny. Which is in some ways to clarify any other farce.
That's right.
The farce.
The tragic figure is always the heroic figure in literature and drama. Tragedy is not a tragedy in the sense that popular ideas would have it. The tragic figure is the heroic figure who will live again, who dies in order that we may live and that he will live again.
Right.
I'm sorry.
No, that's what you said was important, because like I think in some ways we're getting closer to the right language to describe why Baldwin is so significant in this time. Because it's even less about just Baldwin, but it's Baldwin as an articulator of the man of destiny. Like Baldwin as the articulator of King and the task that King began but has to like be reborn for people.
Yes, absolutely.
And okay, the last thing I wanted to say was I wanted to underline what you said. The reason why I think interregnum is such an important concept for right now is that there is such thing as a transitionary period. It's what you said. Like I think what you said that the next stage will never be born easily. It will always be born painfully. That there is such thing as an ideological struggle. Like that there is such thing as a painful rebirth. I feel like that's very important. And because it also does clarify the revolutionary task of today as the ideological struggle, but I also think it defines it as it must be like a very strong reclaiming or even defining of that man of destiny. And I hope I don't sound too abstract, but because basically I'm saying that I think if the man of destiny, if we do not claim King, if we cannot define him as the man of destiny, or in other words, if we cannot define him as the father of a new nation, it also creates the confusion around the farce, or let's say Trump or even J.D. Vance as more representative of the beginnings of a new era, or like, you know, it makes people mistake both what's our inheritance, but also it makes people mistake the beginnings of what must be new, not a collapse into a reform of a decadent system, something that must actually die. Yeah, and I think that's why I think it's very clarifying for the moment we're in now. Because in some ways it helps clarify even Free School's position of the relationship between, let's say, King, who is the father of the nation, the Third American Revolution, which is the revolution that was not completely fulfilled, but must be picked up in a new revolution, which would also transform the American people who may be awakened, but who have not necessarily proceeded forward yet.
And can I just say this?
Yeah.
And in this time, as opposed to the previous revolutionary period, the revolutionary essence of democracy is more realizable now than then.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And that's why, Emily and I are writing a script for a documentary on Baldwin the Revolutionary, by the way, entitled To Fulfill the Unfulfilled, James Baldwin the Revolutionary. And what we're trying to get at is that we are now in the moment of fulfilling, but not what was, but in a more where the revolutionary possibilities are greater now than then. But the inheritance upon which we build come from them then.
Yeah.
Can I just say this? Forgive me, I don't want to talk too much, but what Emily was mentioning about in our reading group at the Central Branch of the Free Library, and probably you will agree with me, I think, on this. With the assassination of Martin Luther King, the young generation or young people like myself lost all hope in the peaceful path to revolutionary change. I mean, all hope. And we decided that the only path to revolution was insurrectionary violence. I was an advocate of that and of urban guerrilla warfare, and there was a song by, who was it? It's in part, bring dynamite and a crane, tear it down and we'll start all over again. So we were prepared to throw ourselves at the system. If you kill King, then we will destroy the society. And we did not see the future, we saw the now. And we had I had this. And this was in the Nation of Islam's worldview, that the white man must be brought down by any means necessary. That's the way we thought. And I'm sorry, I don't
No, that's
but then there was Baldwin. But Baldwin was in the wilderness.
right.
We didn't want to hear Baldwin. We had our own thing. Ethic. You gonna kill King? Come on, let's get it on there. Let's throw down. And we'll find a way to F you up. That's the way we were talking. I'm using those words because we're in a church, using letters. That's the way I thought. That is and I wasn't the only one.
Right.
I'm sorry.
Because even Baldwin, I think that's also in some ways the emotional thing of Baldwin, which is Baldwin recognized that too, like Baldwin, even in the passage we were reading, Baldwin was like, honestly, maybe Malcolm was right.
Yeah, that's what he said.
And that's also what makes Baldwin so, in some ways, it's very emotional in the sense that he's such a revolutionary, because for him, he's like, that feeling, what you just said of the now, but what of the future? The now, but what of the future? And that's what makes him such a loyal, he didn't have to be loyal, such a loyal articulator.
That's right.
Such a loyal articulator of a man who was beyond the now. And in some ways, that's why Baldwin speaks directly to us, like to our time. And I guess another thing, maybe this is going too far, but the thing of that there's something more realizable now than even back then I think in some ways a word that you always use, Doc, that I felt like was really deep is you always talk about a whole people. Like
all humanity.
Yeah, an all humanity process. In some ways, like a whole people or all humanity struggle for democracy. Right? Because in some ways and I don't have a theory for this, but basically that there's a difference, for example, between, let's say, seeing something as class struggle, or how it's, I don't know how it's defined, but a whole people struggle today is like, I basically feel like there's more of an open opportunity for today of a whole people struggle against war, and basically in some ways how King phrased it, the evils that will forever not just allow war to happen, but basically allow a decadent society to like desperately and like so horrifyingly ravage on and on and on. And yeah, I guess I just wanted to add that concept to what you were saying. Which is also why, see, Baldwin for me, Baldwin doesn't have to go as far as he does, but he does. Where Baldwin says, because of King, Baldwin says, even though it'd be easier for me to believe this true, I know it's not true. Whiteness is not a constant. Whiteness is not natural. Whiteness is an invention. And if it is an invention, then it is also a moral choice to reject. Like Baldwin, he's giving the people the tools they need to embark on a whole people's struggle for an emancipatory democracy. And yeah.
Can I just ask a question? So, Duthat references both Hegel and Thomas Carlyle in the essay, and I was just trying to read on Carlyle on Wikipedia, and it seems like Carlyle is more responsible for what's called like the great man theory of history.
Yes.
But and then so I don't know, I'm very unlettered and unschooled in like the actual differences between like Hegel versus Carlyle, like that whole thing. But how do you conceptualize something like that? Like basically where the great man theory of history, which I've actually seen used a lot in the Trump movement to describe Trump, where it's like you see history as being driven by quote unquote great men, people like, I mean, today for them it's Trump, but then in the past it's been like other like world historic figures. Is there, I guess I don't know if it's in Hegel or if it's in Marx or if there's another way of framing it, but what is basically a relationship between the view of history, which basically
He did is another question. See, Marx rejects the single man theory of history and says that all history is a history of conflict, class conflict, I mean, and that if societies are going to be revolutionized, it must be a revolutionary class that will take power. Revolutionary class means a class led by revolutionary ideas. So that's Marx's answer. But for me, it still leaves, in a certain sense, the unanswered question. I think Hegel hit on something, the man of destiny. A man whose very being, and gets it right in the article, that a man that embodies what Hegel calls world spirit is unstoppable because the world spirit is unstoppable. Now that thinking is really all over us. Theodore Parker, the Unitarian preacher, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Or Martin Luther King, referencing St. Augustine, man is made for God. Now, what is God? Is a question, but man is made for God and will not find peace until he finds him. That is, so you just can't, yes, it is the people that make history. That is true. But that does not answer the whole question. You know what I'm saying? There are, quote, great men, in science, in ideas. Lenin is a great man. Du Bois is a great man. You know what I'm saying? So what do you do with them? Do you go into a default or reductionism? Oh, they were just representatives of the class conscience. Oh, come on, dog. They were more than that. You know what I'm saying? They went beyond, and Hegel is right about this. You know, and Marx remained a Hegelian, I think, but in a different way. Look, he is right. There are people who, in their being, and they can't even control it, embody a future that they will never see. So that's the way I would put it. Now, I'm not talking about Carlyle's man on a white horse type of thing, you know, but it is a relationship between a special human being and history itself. They see, that's why Baldwin and King are so, you just keep going back to them because, well, how could he get that right there? Because they embodied something that was bigger than they. And that's the key, I think. And we still, if God touches the one small thing, we just don't know how that all comes about.
Yeah.
Like the great poet, the great artist. You know, how did they do that? How could they write that? But there is something between, and there's something more than the materiality of their beings, the physicality of their beings. There's something spiritual about the whole damn thing.
Yeah.
Because I feel like, well, just to add, I think part of the reason why I asked is because I feel like in free school, I feel like we sometimes get the question of like, why do you uphold, basically? Why is free schools also like way of thinking so anchored in like wanting to uplift certain figures? Especially King. And obviously, yeah, the year of Baldwin. And I feel like the implicit critique is like, oh, you guys are just upholding quote unquote great men. And that is like basically kind of indicative of a
Put
certain
the emphasis on man.
Yeah, right. And so I think that's part of the
by the way, whose greatness cannot be gendered.
Yeah.
Since you want to go trans, I mean, they probably, but anyway.
No, so yeah, I'm also trying to make it out too. Like, yeah, actually, what is, because yeah, a lot of this gets to, yeah, what is our philosophy of history? Which I think is a larger question, which we're in the process of working out. But yeah, the other thing that occurred to me is, I feel like it's easy, but also very dangerous, I think, sometimes to make certain like comparisons or allegories. But you could make an argument that if, in some ways, if King is a Christ-like figure for America and for the American people and for the world's people, in some ways, the closest analogy that you can also make is that Baldwin is almost like John the Baptist in some ways, because
you wouldn't say Paul.
I don't think Paul, because
I would agree with you, probably.
Because Paul is more about the building of the institution of the church. I don't think that is what Baldwin was actually, that wasn't really Baldwin's role. But John the Baptist's role is to kind of be the witness to Christ and to be the voice, like also like the voice in the wilderness kind of thing. Who's also seen as kind of like eccentric or seen as not normal, basically by the standards of society. And I feel like Baldwin in a similar way is kind of like, he's kind of like the John the Baptist for King. Although I don't know exactly how far you can take that comparison, but I was just thinking about that.
Go ahead, Ike.
As usual, you guys do stuff that's really good. I was thinking about the point that you were making about folks in our generation and that kind of being torn in terms of violence versus something other than violence. And a friend of mine, a seminary classmate who died not long ago. We were in the same class. Apparently, the dean of the seminary would invite small groups of us, into his office, and he'd ask, why are you here? And Ed's response was, I'm here because rather than burn with rap, I prefer to build with Martin. And
Burn with Ralph Abernathy.
Rap Brown.
Rap Brown, H. Rap Brown. Okay.
And I always, he's one of these guys. I always knew he was smart as heck, and so forth, and that just confirms it. The contrast between Martin and Donald Trump is person of that. The farce is absolutely appropriate. I think the other thing that's appropriate is about the interregnum and the chaos, the decadence in this period. And just my sense of it is that that's definitely where we're called right now. And that's definitely what a Donald Trump both contributes to and manipulates. And it's not just Al Sharpton, it's one hell of a lot of people in the political class coming out of the black community that join in that farcical role or are part of the chaos. I just, for me at least, the question becomes, whether we caught in the middle of the chaos, what the hell do we do? I mean, it's kind of like, some folks would be advocates of whistling as you walk past the cemetery. And I just never have felt like that. The other thing is that, I think this Parker came with that arc of history thing.
Yes.
The arc of history does not bend by itself. Desmond Tutu said something to the effect, we all think that God is almighty. God is weak. God needs us. And the question becomes, it seems to me, again, in this kind of time of decadent chaos, how do we figure out, how do we help others figure out what the hell do we do? And I think one of the things I value about you all as a group, it seems to me you all struggle to do that with some humility. Humility.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, in the past, that kind of work that's done from an elitist perspective, I know better than you know. Let me tell you, everybody understands that elite is bullshit. Everybody understands it. I mean, and there's something about humility, and fundamentally, I think there's something about love that's absolutely got to be a part of that work. If we or anybody has the chance to be a part of that kind of bending in the interactive chaotic period. And again, it just feels to me like that's what we stuck stone cold in the middle of. For lack of a better word, I'm not so sure I see that many Martin Luther King figures to help us through it. That means, unfortunately, then that the shit falls on us. You know what I mean? I mean, we become the people that got to embody something about a vision. We become the people that have to help others to begin to grasp and be grasped by that. And then we become the people who have to figure out what the fuck do we do now? I mean, I'm talking about Bishop, but you got that. And if you stop and think about it, I'm not so sure there's not I can't think of a lot more that's more exciting. I mean, everybody would like to be bored every once in a while, but I can't. I mean, it's pretty exciting stuff. And maybe more exciting in a sense than what was going on when we were in, our younger years, because more is at stake.
So
You guys are big committed.
because what did you? What was
Because
that?
more is at stake.
War is at stake. Yes.
No, I think what you said was also really interesting because part of what we're doing is recognizing like what is the opportunity at this time, and coming to what that opportunity is a recognition of I think what Doc you were saying earlier, which is that it requires a scientific method as well of approaching this time, which is what are the assumptions that are undergirding the theories of revolution for this time. Because I think a lot of what you're saying of the theories that, or the dogmas or theories are based on something that it's not scientific and doesn't recognize the uniqueness of this time. And it's always helpful actually to hear you talk about what is specific to this time, because I think many of us here are young people where right now, I think there was a time prior to Trump and the movement and what that represents, but I think many of us here are young enough where prior to that, we were less conscious or aware. And so much of what we are aware of and are trying to make sense of has been this collapse of the West, this anger and resentment of the people that we take those for granted, where those are factors that weren't available to revolutionaries in the past. And given those factors, what does that mean for what we are to do differently actually moving forward, what we can build upon from the past, but also what is unique to this time? Because it makes me think of actually what you had said on Thursday at Parkway Central, which is that King was difficult. King's position was a difficult position to take, actually, to believe that this country and to believe that Americans could be, specifically too, like white Americans, Black Americans could be transformed, where you had, this history of carnage throughout the world and also in America. That something like the Nation of Islam to be like, we're going to do us is much easier than to actually have a vision of transforming the entire country. But in some ways, King has become easier, where now it's not just Black people in this country that are recognizing the collapse. It's actually a much wider segment, whether it's white Americans, whether it's immigrant Americans, whatever it is. And actually, I didn't watch the full Trump speech, but Shambarta mentioned it. I didn't watch the full Trump speech, but Shambarta mentioned this, which is that Trump came, like, wait, that's so close to like what he was saying about, there's a single thing that, what was it?
Yeah, I think he started, like the first thing, like one of the first things he said at his speech on Thursday was like, something like we in America are tied by a single thing and a shared destiny. And when you hear these things, your mind immediately goes, okay, you're almost there. But that's I was thinking, in context of what you were saying, it's very, I think useful to think about like Trump, like how, like, to even think of Trump as something even, that can be compared to King. It's a difficult leap for most people to take. But I think, with what you're saying regarding, this idea of the different stages of history, it just makes a lot of sense that, this, I agree with, Alan, that it's useful to think about what the future opportunities may be for us to think about Trump in this light. But anyway, sorry, go on.
Yeah, well, because you don't have probably during the 60s, you don't have a figure like Trump that's going against the system actually that produced him. And when Chimbarto told me that, and then also making sense of this man of destiny thing, and the twos of tragedy and farce, I think how you define tragedy in the sense of King being ahead of his time, but in some ways, what speaks to the progress is that time has almost caught up to King. And where, yeah, like sometimes you read King and you're like, wait, this feels like it's for our time. But it was something that, or it was a speech, something he had written back then, back in the 60s, or yeah, 60s. And I think what you were, just your introduction actually was a great reminder, because sometimes it can feel like, or not feel like it is a very chaotic moment, but it's also a very exciting moment, and all of these factors, and actually having to, and part of the pain is that you can't be lazy. Like, you actually have to make sense, like, what is new? What does this mean for our time? What does it mean in terms of what we do? And yeah, I know at least when the assassination attempt happened, all of us were freaking out in the free school, because we were like, holy crap, like, what a time to be alive. And in some ways, that's the closest to King's assassination, or all the assassinations that happened back then, because, you know, someone like Trump already, like, that assassination attempt had thrown us into a moment of like, holy crap. But what must have been like back then when you had King, Malcolm, Medveders, and so forth. Then there's a totally, I guess, a different thing that I actually had a question about, is what you had said between the relationship between civilization and progress, and civilization and modernity. Because I know we've been trying to speak to, you know, China. Do you view it as communist, or do you view it through the lens of a civilization? And also grappling with this question of modernity. Is that at odds, or is modernity at odds with civilization? Is progress at odds with civilization? I think that was a question when I was listening to.
Oh, I am a little bit behind now, but I had a quote, if I can read one, from somebody talking about the sort of generational idea of progress, and that idea of, like, you know, you weren't there, but the ideas are still relevant. I have a favorite philosopher, another liberation theologist called Helder Câmara, who was a Brazilian archbishop. He has a section right at the tail end of a short book titled Appeal to Youth. And the gist of the longer section is that he essentially says, look, I'm an old man and I'm gonna die, and young people are gonna have to carry things forward. And it's a passage that really sort of resonates with me. If it's all right if I read part of it, I am gonna, just for transparency, cut some chunks of this that you have to have read the larger book to catch. And now I have a question to ask you, precisely because I know that we all have a world in common, even if you disagree with me and consider me a dreamer and a fool. You have heard my appeal. The important thing now is not to agree with its positions, but to discuss them. I have no need to ask you for sincerity. You abhor hypocrisy and lies. I ask you to challenge facts with facts, arguments with arguments. I ask you to bring new points of view or new perspectives. If I know you as well as I think I do, we are in agreement on our way of looking at this world, which is groaning with injustices. You will agree in recognizing that in general, youth is losing patience and slipping into radical action and armed violence. You also agree that the governments are ready to react in a brutal way, and they have no scruples, even when it comes to torture. Your doubt, or the doubt of many of you, bears on the following point. Is nonviolence feasible, even in a positive and demanding movement? Whoop. What separates us? We are united in our aims. We wish for a more just and human world. I know your sincerity and I respect your choice. Leave no one indifferent around you. Provoke discussion. Your youth must force people to think and take up a position. Let it be uncomfortable like truth, demanding like justice. This is my appeal. Bring me your warmth and your friendship. With you, I must remain young in soul, keep the hope and love I need to help all men our brothers. And that's the end of the book. I think that is something that I think about a lot in terms of when we talk about a philosophy or a set of thinking or a politics belonging to a certain time or not. I think there's always some piece of just about every piece of thinking that does eventually become outdated, but that doesn't mean that we can't still carry the important stuff forward. And I think that this is what we're doing. We are discussing it and thinking sincerely, even if we do or don't agree, right? One of the most important pieces is that we take the writing of people like King and Baldwin, and the broader movement seriously and consider the principles and consider how we want to move it forward, given that, ahead of one's time or not, King and Baldwin didn't have a magic window into the future to see where we're at right now. So it's up to us to figure out where we want to go from here.
Well, what's interesting about what you said is, in some ways, some of what you're saying is related to something I forgot to say earlier, which is, I kind of think there's something important about defining the man of destiny as a particular concept as, let's just take King, because I know man of destiny is so let's take King. That what makes King a man of destiny is that he's an embodiment, an embodiment of progress, an embodiment of history. I feel like, because I kept thinking about that, where I was like, well, what does that really mean? Because essentially to say that someone can be an embodiment of history means that time is not neutral. Does that make sense? Like, that there is such thing as a direction of history. I guess progress. That's the concept of progress. But this thing of there is such thing as like, history is not a free for all. Like time, it's kind of like those when people do math, like when people make mathematical graphs, and they show like, I guess when you're doing statistical probability, they show like a path, let's say like the growth of something, and it goes up, but then there's the path, but then there's like a wide array of the possibilities. Like this is the delineation of the possibilities along that path. That there is such thing as time is not neutral. Time has a direction, and it has there's a determined. And that's the whole point of like that, the arc of the moral universe bends. Like it's not like, if it was a free for all, then it's just space, right? Time is not space. There's a direction. It's not neutral, and that's why why is King an embodiment of history? Well, it means that you have to actually define history. It means you have to actually define progress as something. There's not a free for all. Because the reason why this is important is if you can define that, then it also explains what are the little dots or clusters that Trump captures. But he doesn't he's not the embodiment. But the thing is, he's not the embodiment of history. He's not the embodiment of history. He can't be the actual embodiment of progress or the complete arc of history. That's what makes him a farce. But what makes him compelling, an important figure is the little dust clusters the little clusters he catches from that path. He happens to catch so in some ways he catches onto some of what defines this historical moment or even this crisis, which is the discontented, a people who were promised cheaper goods if you agree with the war policy. But then it turns out that there is such thing as not just even karma, but economic law, like the law of, that there is such thing as the repercussions of an economy that's totally based on exporting labor for cheaper goods or a higher quality of life at a lower price, and exporting capital. And those are the little, like, in some ways, like I know I'm talking like abstractly and metaphorically, but those are the little clusters that someone like Trump or even JD Vance or this emerging quote unquote Republican Party captures onto. But they're not the embodiment of the actual crisis. They're not the embodiment of real history. And they're also not the embodiment of the future. Like, and that's what makes Trump farce, is that he can only be in some ways an emulation or an embodiment of now, or even maybe the past, or like a people who are very discontented, like a coalition of discontented people. And I just feel like I guess that was important, because in some of what you're saying, it's true, but I feel like there's something, it made me think this thing of like, but we're not talking about, but at the same time, I think it's so important to not see what we're talking about as like universal in an abstract sense.
Yeah.
But actually that when we say like an embodiment of history, it's us saying that there is such thing as history is specific. Like we're talking about we're talking about history has a direction. And King is, and thus like what makes King an embodiment, like what makes him an embodiment of something is that we are also defining the crisis. Like,
right.
Why is King the man of destiny and not like FDR? Well, because King is actually exactly defining both the crisis. He's defining a whole society's crisis. White supremacy, but also the exploitation of man, and not just economically, but the exploitation of soul, the corruption of soul, the corruption of the human being. Like, King is an embodiment of a historical crisis that will have to be resolved. And even though he's assassinated, it's the same. He's still an embodiment of something that's not resolved.
Yeah.
Right. I really like the term the New York Times writer used, which was avatar.
Oh.
Why do you like that term?
So I'm about to say something completely ridiculous, and I'm sorry ahead of time. I myself would consider myself a gamer, right? And I got all my syllables in the right order. The avatar represents the sort of symbol of the player's capacity to interact with the world, right? It's a way of locating oneself in space, because, in theory, if we look at like video games as a metaphor, you could just not have the character there, right? You could interact all the same. It would just be harder to understand and connect with if the sort of player character, the avatar, was not visible.
But when you say avatar, is that the same as protagonist?
Not necessarily. The avatar is more so just the image that represents the player. Regardless of how they act upon the world around them, the avatar is the image that lets you point and say, that's me, right? Or that's the main character. And I think that avatar is a really apt word to describe Trump as opposed to King, right? As in, the avatar in a video game is manipulated, right? And in many ways controlled by outside forces, and as an image has some power of its own, right? You recognize that as separate from yourself, right? And I think that neatly kind of sums up where I personally feel Trump is at, like a representation of a number of factors acting on the world and a character unto himself, but not necessarily driving the story on his own, right? And more so not defining an era, but a convenient receptacle in which we can place our ideas of many, many different overlapping pieces.
Well, okay. Well, I feel like part of it is that King, like there's King the man, but there's also like King the visionary, I feel like, which is why we're spending a lot of time talking and thinking about how he resonates today, like how far his vision actually stretched and like reached the future for now. Whereas I feel like Trump, like, yes, like he's an embodiment of forces now and in the present, but I feel like the fact that like 8 years in, we're still not really sure what the vision is. And so like thinking about history, I feel like that 50 years from now, like how will we recognize Trump? Like, will it really be like, oh damn, like Trump was talking about the future? Like, I don't think, I think that's basically the difference. Like one of the big differences between King and Trump, even if both are an embodiment of something that is like part of the world spirit. Because I feel like part of it is yeah, like I guess the discontented, where I feel comfortable saying like Trump represents the failures of like like up to this point or like this period, and so therefore like the failures and the crisis show the opportunity. But I feel like King was not like representative of like just a crisis. I feel like he was actually like yeah, like making a vision towards the future. And I feel like in some ways like this avatar idea, like the great men idea, and like this thing of like, are you a best, like, because I feel like there's a way that you could look at this idealistic thing where it's like, oh, this man is not a man, like he's a vessel of history. Like he's channeled by the world spirit, but he's like compelled to do things like without necessarily like consciousness or like intentional driving, but almost just like impulse of world spirit. And I feel like the thing is like, King had like destiny, and I feel like he had a sense of destiny, but I also feel like he had like a level of consciousness or like forward thinking, and like in some ways like he was prepared. Yeah. Like I feel like the thing that we were actually talking about, where like when he arrived in Montgomery, it was like almost as though God had prepared him for Montgomery and also the trials ahead. And even if he didn't fully recognize exactly where it would lead him, he was equipped to basically meet the moment. And I feel like, I don't know, but basically, I feel like because now is a moment of such crisis, Trump has been like the vehicle, or in some ways, yeah, like the consolidator of like making that that crisis very apparent to people, to then, I think, like in many other ways, like organize or like have a vision or like show that there are competing visions. But I think actually some of it is partially like thinking about Trump and JD Vance and like maybe the future of the Republican Party, which is like, what is the vision and where is that actually going to go? And is that vision like actually progressive, like in the world spirit? Yeah.
Well, okay, just one clarification I wanted to make is some of what you're also saying is like, okay, when I say time is not neutral, I also mean that like the reason why Baldwin can write an autobiography of a people means that there is such thing as a direction of where people are going. It's not just like a widespread like that King is an embodiment of a whole people's process, like a whole people who are like, whether they self-recognize or not, are already on a certain path in American history to like achieve something together if they so choose to. I guess that's what I meant by like because Baldwin can only write an autobiography of a whole people. Like it's an American people. Yeah, it's because the people exist or going to be exist. They're like, you know, and I feel like that's important because I mean we're gonna go into it with Trump and JD Vance, but like I was thinking a lot about how the RNC clearly does not represent the whole people. Like only Baldwin would be able to write an autobiography of not even just himself, but also a whole people. When he's describing the assassination of King, what happened, like, that's a whole people's history. Like that's a whole people's something that affected every single person, whether they realized it or not. But Yeah, I just wanted to make that clarification. Sorry, Reverend.
I don't know why I'm gonna say this, but there's something almost want to say it feels to me like there's a sociological dimension to this, which may be a part of quote unquote, how people becomes a people. But there's no question in my mind. I think I have Bernice Reagan's death in my head. There's no question in my mind about the fact that the culture that produced her and that music that they did back in the day, that music that I can recall clearly, kind of like, keeping me going when you're scared as hell walking a picket line or something like that. One of the great songs, by the way, is the first line, up above my head, I hear freedom in the air. I think Martin and Baldwin also are a product of that kind of culture as much as anything else. And that part of what you almost automatically have to be concerned about is nurturing the culture out of which folks of that stature can come and can emerge. And what's scary with the T.G. Jakes, the Sharptons, the other hustlers, is that, they undermine that culture that produces folks like that. The other thing is, my suspicion is that that's true in other cultures worldwide. You know what I mean? I mean, there's a fertile, whatever you want to call it, that is with the people that nurtures the stuff that determines what this history is about. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, if we don't pay attention to those folks down there, then we end up in the kind of deep doo that the Democratic Party has prepared, for the culture as a whole. I'm not just talking about black people, I'm talking about the way in which that stuff gets distorted. And when you forget that, it means that a kind of hustler, manipulator, whatever, like Donald Trump, boom, that's the time. And the other thing that, again, that strikes me is that, in periods of chaos, when things are up in the air, those are incredible periods of opportunity.
Right.
I mean, they are mind-blowing, good periods of opportunity. But you guys, I got to get out of here. I got to write a damn sermon for tomorrow morning.
Hey, you got your sermon already.
Yeah, no, I was about to say, but you guys talk, this stuff and so forth. It takes me 2 or 3 minutes to figure out what the hell were we talking about. Again, I can't tell you how much grateful that you all put up with an old guy coming there who doesn't know what the hell he's talking about most of the time. But if I don't get moving, I'm okay.
Take care, man.
Will we see you tomorrow? Will we see you tomorrow? Will we see you tomorrow?
Oh, yeah. I'll be there.
Yeah, it used to be up above my head. Out here.
Over my head.
Wait,
I see you.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Music class.
Something like that.
Music isn't that
They just chant, yeah.
Just to add on to what Reverend Miller was saying at the end about listening to the people and this idea of Donald Trump as a I was talking to my neighbor about the the Joe Biden stuff, and she has Black Lives Matter, Biden, Harris in front of her lawn. She was trying to convince me as a youngest person on the block to vote, and she said, "Oh well, inflation is down." So I've been thinking about that all week, and inflation is down because the dollar is up, and when the dollar is up, that means that imports, it's better for imports, but it's worse for exports. And what the Trump base and the selection of JD Vance is really indicating is, Trump's base really understands this need. And the CrowdStrike, disaster on Friday, it is all about supply chains and what's, American-based business parasitized by international business. I mean, that's really what the CrowdStrike, fiasco. It's essentially a supply chain, and it's tech monopolies eating up smaller tech monopolies and providing a worse and worse service. And so Biden or Trump's base inherently understands that what's good for the country is to bring production, all kinds, tech and manufacturing back to America. And what economists and my neighbor are trying to tell people is like, no, the economy is good. You should be grateful for your situation. It's that contempt of the people. And, people don't need to have an understand what's going on. And we, all over the world, there's this phenomenon of Modi's, Trump, Imran Khan, Bolsonaro, Duterte in the Philippines, Erdogan in Turkey, Putin in Russia, of countries all around the world that are part of this worldwide movement to say, no, the sovereignty of the state is an important thing. So even if there is, let's say like a left option that appears, voters reject that. We have to ask this question: why are voters rejecting the left, the so-called left around the world? And it's because there is a positive option on the table, and that is to choose a leader like Donald Trump, who he's really being propelled by his base. I think there's more to it. I haven't clearly articulated it, but Trump is being propelled, from the bottom up, and people can be in denial about all they want.
Right.
But the question still needs to be asked.
There was an article in the New York Times last week, basically comparing Trump to William McKinley. That's his name, right? President McKinley. And
that's what's his name? Oren.
Oh, who wrote it?
Oren Cass.
Okay.
Yeah, he wrote it. Yeah, I think that's his essay.
But it's interesting.
I don't know that that's the case. I'm sorry.
I'll send it to you.
Yeah,
but they were basically comparing Trump to William McKinley because I don't know very much about McKinley, but what I learned from the article was that McKinley was very big on protectionism and tariffs, and a lot of that was to basically say, like, America is not Europe. We're not going to integrate with Europe. We're going to, have self-determination. And I'm very, brutally summing that up. But no, it's just really interesting. I think building off what Samir said, it seems to me that, people see MAGA or Trump and Vance as maybe a break from Europe, a break from our modernity. And it's interesting.
Well, I wanted to add something because what we've been talking about, it made me think about Nuri Parva and I have been meeting to talk about how we want to frame Baldwin for the next semester of Lotus, and especially in the wake of the student movement and its return in the fall and the shape it might take. And I think the direction we've been going in is that we want to make inseparable Baldwin and the civil rights movement. But what you guys were saying, it made me think about also this idea of the fluke, because Lawson and King, ideologues like Lawson and King and leaders Diane Nash, I feel like what was valuable also was that when they were able to locate a movement as it was beginning. And I liked this phrase that I think was in Halberstam's book about the civil rights movement, where he said, Lawson, when they saw what was happening in Montgomery, they were convinced it wasn't a fluke.
You know what I'm saying is there is just something there that I feel like can be drawn out or was deep to me. And then I was also thinking about something else that like Diane Nash said in one of her interviews a couple decades after the Nashville sit-in movement, where she said, I'm actually surprised that people are not studying nonviolence as much as they could be, given that it was so successful, like in our campaigns in the South. But she also said, Martin has all my admiration. Like I greatly respect and admire him, and I also liked him very much. But I think it's a mistake for the generation now to wait for a leader like Martin, because like it basically distorts Martin's role in the movement. She was like, I don't take anything away from Martin's contribution, but the Nashville student movement, like we took the shaping of history into our own hands. And it's almost the way she said it made it sound so simple, where she said we formulated an objective, we formulated a strategy, like, and I say something, for some reason, like those ideas are connected in my head, but this thing about the fluke and not reading things as a fluke, I think is something, for example, that I think the Trump movement is missing, or the way that also people regard the Trump movement is also missing. Like none of it is a fluke. And I feel like what makes Baldwin a revolutionary theorist or a modern revolutionary theorist is that he never reads anything as a fluke either. Like talking about him as an autobiographer, I mean, you really see this thing in his essays and his novels that people are driven by history. And like, if people are made by history, then there is also a movement or a logic or a development of history. And I feel like part of our investigation of Baldwin is also an investigation of that, the way this logic extends through now into like the forthcoming future. But again, like for some reason, the fluke idea just really stuck out to me, because in Halberstam's book, he says, like, what made that union between James Lawson and Martin King so remarkable is that they both knew what was happening in Montgomery was not coincidence. It was prophecy.
I wanted to add to this, where in the Duthat article, I mean, there are some things that stuck out to me and I appreciated. For instance, he does make the case that in a society that's fallen into decadence, what does the man of destiny look like? And that is the context in which he's trying to understand Trump, where he says that what if this, I think he says, what if this is not a vital time, but a decadent time? I think that's a formulation I don't fully understand, but then I think one of the weaknesses in how he sees the man of destiny and Trump being the man of destiny in this moment is the way it's related, or it made me think of what Michelle was saying, something accidental, something that can't fully be explained. And he says that Trump is the archetypal populist leader, like of all the populist leaders in the world, he becomes archetypal because in some ways he manifests almost an ideological incoherence among the people itself. Where, that's what he's trying to say, that, the people, usually their emphasis is not so much on policy, but who the enemy is. And that is why Trump, who does not have ideological coherence, very little intellectual curiosity is the phrase I think he uses. That is why a figure like him becomes the man of destiny in a moment of decadence, which I think it misses an important aspect of, the will of the people, which I think is definitely connected to the idea of the man of destiny embodying history. It's an embodiment of history, but it also has to be an embodiment of the aspirations of the people in that historical moment. And I think this question of tragedy and farce, the way I'm trying to understand this, what does it say about the future of the American revolutionary process, where this idea of history coming in twos, a repetition of what has already happened once as tragedy, but then the next time as farce. I'd like to ask Doc, like, how general do you think this history repeats itself thing is? Because it's hard for me to place every world revolutionary struggle in that mold. But then I think it does make a lot of sense when there has been something unfulfilled, like you were saying, a betrayal of a people's democratic struggle. That is the tragic part, which then again repeats itself as a farcical, yeah, right? So, and then even what Nuri was saying, when King entered the stage of world history, he did it. He did it because he accepted the call of his people. Well, a sense of predestiny, but he actually had to make that moral choice that now I'm being called to be the vessel through which the people's ideas can triumph, and that's but then I think it's important to keep the people at the center to even try and understand, because this question of is Trump the farce, history repeating itself as farce, I think it relates to the question of, okay, it looks like he'll succeed, it looks like his movement will succeed, but will it be the success of the American revolutionary process? With the glaring deficiencies we do see in the Trump movement. But anyway, that's how I was trying to make sense of it.
I think it's I think what Marx said is a metaphor for certain things in history, because history doesn't stop at farce.
Yes. Yeah.
And could the quote man of destiny be Xi Jinping? Why would it have to be a Western man?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this a couple weeks ago. We were talking about how the civil rights movement came out of. I think Jeremiah brought this up. The idea that it came out of an upward mobility for a lot of people in America. It wasn't just the 40s and 50s and 60s for a lot of white American workers. The living standards were rising. But however, the black workers got left out of that equation. I think, and that was, one of the impetus behind that movement, I feel, was people coming home from World War II, black Americans who couldn't even sit at the same restaurant, couldn't buy a home, couldn't have access to these higher income jobs. And so it was this unfulfilled group of people who were looking for more fulfillment. Obviously, there's a spiritual and ideological dimension to that, as well as economic. And Trump very much, I think, can see the white worker who's now being left behind and being told, as the Biden administration will say, it's the best economy we've ever had. Obviously, that rings hollow to many white workers and black workers. And that's sort of the way that the Democratic Party has sort of defended themselves. Reminds me of how the white South, and the racist white North tried to say, why are black people so upset? All these good things are happening. Why can't they just enjoy this prosperity? But I guess from the civil rights movement, I can definitely see how King could see the direct corollary between black Americans and the rest of the world, the darker world. That's how he could connect, the North Vietnamese with, people in his own neighborhood. And that's still, I think, a thing that the Trump issue is in many ways, they still are kind of separating these two groups in certain ways. Whereas the civil rights movement very much recognized how, any worker, any division of the working class in that way is going to bring it's going to be an ability for that class to utilize to break apart this movement. That's why I think King moved on to so much always talks about Reconstruction as a black white worker. How do these things get reconciled, especially in this moment where when Trump's talking about making America great, he's still talking about that sort of golden history of the industrialization of America bringing up working white class jobs. He's still not, I think, making that connection to how that was a divisive time economically for both of those working positions. So that's I think that's kind of what I see a lot of this question being focused on, is sort of how are we able to unite the entire working class in this way? I mean, the term deep state is helpful in trying to assess that there is a conflict, that this isn't this like Ronald Reagan, as Trump promotes, talked about, rising tide raises all boats. Well, clearly that's not quite the case here. But this term deep state is sort of nebulous, it's sort of shadowy. What exactly are we talking about? We know there is an us, they, right? But how do we more accurately define what it is that we're fighting for? Positive, not merely that negation, that indefinite negation that I think Trump in many ways represents. How do we connect that to, like you said, Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin or the different peoples that are uniting in so many ways, and I think opening up their arms to America. Like that's the world historic figure that King represents, that Trump is touching at in certain ways, because I think, the essence of the Trump movement is built upon how do we get freedom? How do we get out from under these forces that are putting fetters and limiting our ability to grow? But they can only see it from the American context of this division in labor, this artificial division in labor between the black and the white. And so this need for hegemonism, this sort of, as much as I appreciate J.D. Vance saying things like, we need to get out of moralizing about our foreign policy. Why can't we do what the Chinese do, building bridges and roads and helping poor people? He will say that, but he will also talk about how we need to outcompete China, how do we need to, control Iran. So it's like you guys are saying, it's so close in certain ways, and just admitting that the Chinese government does that is a big step. It's admitting that there is something outside of this bubble that we consider the whole world in America. How do we make that connection more real to people? How do we have that more accepting of that view? And I do hear that from Trump voters, of the ability to listen and hear and try to understand things outside of what they've been told.
There's a term that I like by Gore Vidal called American amnesia, and how Americans they're amnesiac about their own history. And just recently we had the Mueller special counsel, and all these Congress, I think it was senators, Democratic senators, were going after special counsel Hur about how he said that Biden is well-intentioned old man, but he forgets details. And just that statement, all these Democratic, basically the ruling class went after him for that. And now it's like we've all forgotten, and now all these Democrats are outraged. And how could Biden's aides have hidden his mental decline? And we forget that they were all responsible for hiding it, and they all knew. And Dianne Feinstein, like there was an article about her and how she was not mentally present, and her aides would tell her what to vote for that day. Nancy Pelosi just retired. The whole ruling class is geriatric, and they don't have anything new to offer. And just speaking about the deep state, it really is a select educated view. And I guess that's why people are accusing Donald Trump and J.D. Vance of being elitist, being backed by Peter Thiel, and they're in the pockets of billionaires. At least that's a Democratic slogan, so it's no surprise it's probably a CPUSA slogan. And
Which is
the slogan that J.D. Vance is a billionaire plaything because he's backed by venture capital, and he was a venture capital, or that Trump is a billionaire. And that's what I get. That's what I get in mail. And as you said, the left went along with this ruling class, but how it comes back to this question about history, and to answer Emil's question, like how do we make Americans interested in their history and not like in ancient history like Napoleon? That's not ancient. I'm sorry, but recent history. How can we make them? We should be encouraging Americans that history is important, like our recent history. Like there is a direction, and that sort of Michelle was talking about flukes. Like, it's not a fluke that all these Democrats were attacking special counsel Hurd. They should be held accountable, held responsible. And actually, we should take the lead of the people, unlike Communist Party USA, that they understand more than what we understand about the situation. And that their movement away from the Democratic Party should be, the canary in the coal mine for all the left. And why haven't they made that jump? Why are they in the rear guard? Why are they not in the vanguard?
Doc, can I pose a question to you? Yeah, so I think it's clear to most people that MAGA, we all establish that MAGA is a farce, Trump is a farce. I guess I'll frame this differently. Once it becomes clear to the MAGA base that Trump or his successor Vance is a farce, like where does
Can I
this?
just say one thing?
Yeah.
And I know the word farce.
I'm still learning. I could be using.
No. I could be wrong, but I think both of them are serious, and I do think this is a very serious ideological break. I think Jerry's going to talk about it more, but I don't mean that. Yeah, that's matter of fact. I see Biden as more of a clown than Trump, by the way.
Sure. Yeah.
Forgive me.
No, that's fine. Like, let's say like it's 2028 or something like that. Where do you see this populist momentum that's been building the past 8 years going? And do you see any parallels with this future and the post-King era? Or do you think that there's a lesson that we could all learn from your experience in our future? I don't know if it's too big of a question, but
it's a big one. I mean, just I don't want to talk too much. We're in one of those moments, and again, let me just think a little bit more here, and when Jerry talks, maybe.
But I want to add one thing, this question of, I feel like when for instance, with that article that when the elite talks about the incoherence in Trump, I think a lot of it also reveals that what they're really trying to say is that it's incoherent in terms of it's not economically predetermined, or it's like what they're saying is that these what the Trump movement stands for is incoherent in terms of an economic direction. And I think the thing is, and maybe this is what Jeremiah will get into later, but the thing is, for the elite, the question of the people being economically determined, as in acting in terms of their economic interests alone, it still rests on the premise that America is still the superpower in the world, post-Cold War. But I think the Trump movement, at least it starts from the place that no, we are we are entering a new world. So even when they talk about China, which there's a lot I don't agree with, but even when they talk about China, what they're starting from is that we are no longer in a place where we can dominate China, and therefore this whole question of competition. I mean, it can have many contradictions, but I think it does reveal that the movement and ordinary people are seeing it, that their interests can no longer be tied to the ruling elite, even though they are to act based on their economic interests alone. And I was thinking of this because of something that you were saying initially, and also what somebody else said. This question of modernity and the question of the stages of history, because with the classical definition of yes, history progressing through class conflict, but then over the last century, I think bears testament to the fact that history proceeds more through stages of moral development. That's with King talking about revolution of values, and maybe the idea of values and principles, that's what's modern, and it's a break from maybe 300-year-old history when when we talk about the progress is only through economic change. It's only through the economic movements, and and therefore through class conflict, and it's going to continue forever. But I think we do have this history behind us, which shows that we have entered a new stage where, where we cannot. And I mean, we have been talking about this probably for a while. That the question of economic factor alone does not describe anything at this time anymore. Which is why also yes, sure, the Trump movement and even his speeches and all of that, it's always talking about the question of inflation and what it means for the American people. But how is it that the question of material prosperity for ordinary Americans today is completely aligned with the question of war and peace? And this is why even the whole student movement, there is this kernel which we have been talking about, that which has a possibility of bringing the a new peace movement for our times, which does see Trump as as having a kernel of truth. And it's almost we're saying that truth is in motion. So the idea of economic determinism alone, which served a time, can no longer serve us now. Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking of that when this idea of describing Trump as incoherent in terms of its policies, it's filled with contempt for the people. It's saying people are stupid, so they don't. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we can Jeremiah.
Yeah, a lot of what I had taken notes on also connects to everything we've been talking about. So I'll try to go through it in a clear way. But yeah, I think I don't know if people were surprised about Trump choosing JD Vance, but I think it was not surprising, but it was very clear that Trump was making a very decisive political move by selecting Vance. And I think based off all the reporting that I've seen, Trump had not actually fully made up his mind about who his VP pick would be until basically after the assassination attempt and the RNC, because he was kind of weighing between Vance, Marco Rubio, Doug Burgum, who's Doug Burgum's from a different city.
He's a governor.
Yeah, he's a governor of, I think, one of maybe Dakotas. Yeah, one of the Dakotas. Anyways, so I think it's important to also contextualize. Yeah, Trump choosing JD Vance is how I interpret it is that one, many people have said this, that it shows that Trump is very confident that he can win, because as many people have pointed out, Vance doesn't actually add that much to Trump's electoral chances, according to most political analysts, and that Trump choosing Vance is essentially Trump making a bet on the future of the MAGA movement, especially after his supposed next presidency. And I think that Trump was also basically looking for someone who would fight with him and not against him. And I think it's very important to note that Vance, in that regard, is almost the polar opposite to someone like Mike Pence, whom Trump had picked in 2016, basically in order to gain legitimacy in the Republican Party, and to kind of make some kind of compromise with the establishment of the GOP. And so yeah, I guess we wanted to talk about Vance, and also he's very closely connected to Oren Cass, whose New York Times essay we had read last week, almost in a prophetic way, without necessarily knowing how important that was, because I think in hindsight, and also just in light of what's happened in the past week, I think, what people like Vance and Oren Cass represent is going to become very important, regardless of even how you feel personally about it. And I think, specifically the way that Oren Cass in that New York Times piece had written about framing it as a question of elite failure, and investigating this question of elite failure. And so also, in the past couple of days, especially after Vance was picked, Cass has gone on to do a number of interviews with various outlets, including with Ezra Klein of the New York Times, as well as another one with this European outlet called Unheard, which I think are very interesting. And I guess my current sense of things is that together Vance and Oren Cass kind of represent almost an intellectual spear tip of this young and new faction that's growing within the Republican Party. And they call themselves, they use different terms, but they call themselves, quote, national conservatives or the new right. And they'll often use the term of economic populism as well. And how I basically see it is that this new wing, these national conservatives, are definitely attempting to capitalize on the momentum of MAGA. But more than that, that they're trying to, in their own kind of worldview, to create or achieve an actual philosophy of governance, which would then translate also to how Cass talks about basically a durable governing majority, in which you can have basically over the next couple of decades, like a consistent, almost governing bloc of people who would consistently vote for like for the Republican Party. And I think that this is significant in part because, like we've said, Trump himself doesn't actually really have any consistent political principles. And it's also unclear how interested he is in governing at all. And that he's much more effective as basically a voice of opposition and protest, like we mentioned. And but I think I guess part of how I'm seeing this as well, and I'm interested to hear what other people think, is that although figures like Vance and Cass and like that whole group, although it's very clear that they're connected to the Trump movement, I think it's also accurate to say that at the same time, these figures like J.D. Vance are also essentially part of what I think is almost an inter-elite discourse, in which it's almost like they represent, like if you take Oren Cass's New York Times article as an example, they represent a small and almost marginalized faction within the ruling elite that's trying to correct itself. And so that's kind of the gist of the New York Times article by Oren Cass, where he says, America's elites have failed for the past couple of decades, but this is how the elite can reclaim a legitimacy of rule amongst the people, by basically acknowledging their own failure and then trying to regain the trust of the people again. And I also I was thinking about this too, that sociologically, at the same time, like Vance and Cass represent something that is important, in which like Oren Cass, for instance, he served in like Mitt Romney's campaign in 2012. And then Vance, aside from his very famous roots in like kind of Rust Belt, deindustrialized Ohio, like it's also very well known that, he went to Yale Law School, where he was mentored by Amy Chua, who wrote that book, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, which I read in high school. And anyways, and so also Vance became kind of like a darling of the liberal media after 2016, especially because he started out as a very vocal critic of Trump and almost like a quote unquote never Trumper. And like basically like the media would use him as like an example of like, oh, see, here's someone who's like from Trump's voting base who's actually anti-Trump and all that stuff. And yeah, basically I guess why I bring this up is that, even when you listen to Vance, he talks in a way which is first of all very different from Trump. And I think he's definitely not as skilled as like just a rhetorician and speaker as Trump. But that even aside from like his roots in like the Rust Belt, Vance talks like someone who went to Yale. And I'm not even saying that that's like a bad thing per se, but it's almost like in a similar way to maybe Tucker Carlson. It's like part of what I feel like we're also seeing is like you have this kind of like amorphous group of people, mostly who are like white, who are basically nurtured and brought into elite circles, but then became disillusioned. And I bring this up in part because I think some of us have also gone through a similar kind of trajectory, where let's say like I went to Cornell, and part of what I think has brought me basically into free school, it's like you see basically what's actually happening amongst like, the quote unquote the elite. And you're like, this is like grotesque. Like it's awful. Like I don't want to become part of this. And so I don't know, I just bring that up because I think it's kind of an important dynamic in terms of how they actually operate and even psychologically how they operate. And then I think the other thing I want to say, just to preface too, was that I really disagree with this thing where it's very easy to basically make kind of like hot takes and kind of just say like, oh, like Trump and Vance are all rhetoric and no substance. And I really disagree with that in part, not even just because I am like a Trump supporter, like in that sense, but that it's I think part of what we're also trying to grapple with is that there are real political shifts taking place in the American landscape, and that part of our task is to understand the movement of historical forces, even if you don't personally agree with it. And at the same time, I feel like there's this very common trend amongst people on the left to be like, if only people listened to our group and our party, then everything would become clear. And I think that also, this also gets into like the question of like the theory of the party, whether the party is necessary, is a political necessity for this time. I just bring that up because I feel like I always see that, and people was like, yeah, like if the Trump movement just listened to us, like then like everything would be clear. And I feel like that's a distortion of even how we can even operate in terms of like basically the political landscape. So yeah, I guess I want to also just talk about kind of like the ideological framework and bent of people like J.D. Vance, which I think is ideologically unorthodox. And I don't think that it's basically just the same old. Although I think obviously it also has many weaknesses, and at the same time is in a contradictory way is basically obviously trying to like revive something which is like not really needs to be revived. But I think part of, especially when you listen to Oren Cass, what becomes really clear is that whatever you call them, the national conservatives, like the new right, they are in many ways the most critical of what you can call the Reaganite consensus, which was built upon kind of like these three pillars, one of which was like pro-big business, second of which was pro-war, pro-intervention, and then third of which was social conservatism. And basically the new national conservatives only really want to retain the last part of social conservatism, and they're like, basically we need to rethink these other two pillars. And if you listen to J.D. Vance's speech, which I was not that impressed by, but I think even rhetorically speaking, the language that he uses, the primary category that he uses is the American worker. That's the primary category through which he's also trying to address. And so basically I also wanted to talk through, like what is like almost like the political like and historical framework that they emerge out of, and like the inheritance that they draw from. And to also, kind of tread through, the historical trajectory that led up to this point, where I think, Samir also brought this up. But part of what I think people like Oren Cass, they're emerging in response to or in reaction to is that, like we've talked about, like after World War II, the US dollar becomes a global reserve currency. And so as part of that, the consensus among the US ruling elite became, let's move production from the US to poorer countries with cheap labor. And because as part of that, having the dollar assuming a higher value means that it's more expensive to employ American workers. And that this means, like Samir was pointed out, this basically leads to a trade deficit that has only grown over time, in which America imports and purchases goods from abroad, and in return, foreign countries acquire American assets in the form of debt or treasury bonds to fill like their like kind of foreign currency reserves. And so at the same time as this is happening, the U.S. government is beginning to rapidly expand its war spending, especially through the Cold War, and is able to do that by financing through debt. And so all this is connected basically to like the US dollar thing. And also as part of that is like with countries possessing like American assets, that also means that the US can take advantage of that by basically weaponizing those assets via sanctions or via like freezing those assets like the US has done to Russia recently. And then basically part of, I guess, I'm just trying to like lay out things like the historical trajectory, but that as part of this, you also had the emergence of like the neoliberal consensus, which people like Cass criticize a lot, which is that it's like the notion that basically all trade is good, even if that trade just basically means goods flowing into the US and dollars flowing out. And then I think this also connects to like the China thing that we brought up, where like basically after the US and China achieved the détente, and like the end of the Cold War, basically the US government grants China, quote unquote, the most favored nation trade status in like 2000, I think. And obviously this is in part because China has a huge, and at that time, a very cheap labor force. And basically the ruling elite thought that China would be content with this kind of like the existing global pecking order, but basically being like very cheap labor, rather than what has actually happened of basically then leaping through stages of actual industrialization and development. And that also they thought that integrating China into in the kind of like the new global economy would mean basically that this would lead to the liberalization of China rather than China remaining united under the leadership of the Communist Party. And so I think I bring that up in part because it's like, I feel like we do have to say, like, yeah, like, did quote unquote American jobs get shipped overseas to China? And like, yes, they did. But I think part of the like distortion of it is that like most of those jobs are not just going to China, they're also going to like basically the rest of Asia and Latin America as well. And that also deindustrialization in the US began far before China was ever integrated into like the World Trade Organization, for instance, in the early 2000s. And like Emily brought up, basically as part of this whole like consensus which dominated from basically like the latter half of the 20th century up until now, like the only benefit that was granted to Americans was that through like cheaper overseas labor and with like the US dollar status, that would mean like basically like cheaper prices and cheaper consumer goods for the American consumer. But obviously, like we've said, like the whole strategy has backfired in an enormous way, in which because America's elites disemboweled the country's own industrial base and basically neglected huge swaths of the population, this laid the seeds for basically now like things like the drug epidemic, which has afflicted both major cities like Philly, but also like huge parts of like rural and deindustrial America and the suburbs even. And this is kind of like the origin story for someone like J.D. Vance. And that basically, like we said, like these swaths of the American people are now coming back at the elite with vengeance and are seizing upon Trump as like kind of their voice, their hammer and their weapon against the elite. And I think part of I think even Joe Biden has basically started to acknowledge, and Trump in his own way, is that as the U.S. moves closer towards the possibility of war with China, basically a destroyed industrial base in America becomes a national security issue, in which then it becomes like, oh, the U.S. is not able to wage war as effectively as it used to. And so that's part of the reason why both Biden and Trump want to bring back, like, for instance, like semiconductor manufacturing to the U.S. And so basically, like, my assessment of like the actual agenda of like people like J.D. Vance and Cass is that their big thing is they want to reindustrialize America. Right. And the foremost way that they want to do this is through tariffs, which is basically like taxing goods that come in that are imported into the US. But the contradiction of this is that imposing, like, let's say like a 50% tariff on China will basically lead to like huge inflation, which is part of the political mandate that Trump is trying to embrace, which is like, Biden brought inflation, I'm going to take inflation down, but I'm going to do that by imposing tariffs, which are designed to basically bring manufacturing back to the US. But by imposing those tariffs, you're actually just going to raise prices and everything. And then also, you know, Trump also wants to do his thing where he really wants to cut taxes and all that. And like was brought up earlier, as part of this, Trump in particular sees himself almost in the vein of someone like William McKinley of the late 1800s. Mm-hmm. And I think this is significant because it raises this question that we've been thinking about of like historical chronology and like almost the political inheritance that you see yourself through. And I think, you know, Trump himself, he did a Bloomberg interview, like a really long Bloomberg interview where he says, I'm trying to do what William McKinley did back in the late 1800s. And so it's not just others who are making the comparison, but he's also claiming that for himself. And then also as part of this, like people like J.D. Vance and Trump, they want to devalue the dollar. But as part of Trump's agenda, if you look at like even their website, like they say explicitly, we want to keep the dollar as a global reserve currency. And then the other parts of it is that, like they take a very like, basically they're trying to move the Republican Party towards like being like pro-worker. And then even like anti-Wall Street, like basically a part of like Vance's like whole speech at the RNC was like basically attacking Wall Street. And then also as part of that being like anti-migrant labor. And so that you've also seen like, you know, Trump trying to move to become more vocal of like certain unions, like Sean O'Brien speaking at the RNC on behalf of the Teamsters, and also leaning more towards like antitrust regulation. And then, like, again, I think the last big pillar is kind of like where they're moving is that they're against like this whole orthodoxy of like neoliberalism and libertarianism, in which you view all economic growth as good, in which basically, for instance, if you take like big tech, as an example, big tech like Silicon Valley is able to create a lot of quote unquote GDP growth. But actually, like that GDP growth doesn't benefit most of the population, and I think like Vance has talked about this a lot, and it's kind of undercut by the fact that he does have close ties to like Peter Thiel and like parts of Silicon Valley, and I think the other big pillar of like basically where the Republican Party is moving towards is like what you can call like foreign policy realism, in which like for instance someone like Oren Cass will very immediately say like, we are living in a multipolar world, but that as part of that, the task is then for America to like vie for its like, quote unquote best interests. But then like the question is like, yeah, what are America's interests? And I don't think that that question has actually been fully addressed by anyone. And it's also clear that it's not really it's not, even if you're going against like the neoconservative establishment, neither Trump nor Vance represent a peace agenda. And a lot of kind of like, again, their foreign policy framing is like through the lens of someone like Andrew Jackson, which is quote unquote isolationist, but it's like, oh, we're willing to like, in their words, punch hard when we need to. And so like that's also the way that Trump kind of self-stylizes himself, where he's like, for me, I'm an isolationist, but when I need to, I'm going to punch hard, which for him means like, assassinating someone like Soleimani, and stuff like that. And so
Some people say that was Pompeo.
But Trump has kind of he's tried to embrace it and being like, this is an example of what like Trump foreign policy means. And I think the really important thing with like Trump and China and like so JD Vance is like, actually, from what I've seen, I don't think that Trump in particular wants war with China. And when he's asked about it, like, oh, like, would you defend Taiwan if China were to quote unquote invade Taiwan? Trump is like really like, I don't really want to get involved in that. And actually, he becomes very critical of Taiwan. He's like, why do we have to expend all this money to protect them? And like they don't even pay, that whole thing, which he also used.
He did say he would not protect.
Yeah. And obviously the other thing is like, the whole Russia-Ukraine thing, where Vance has been very vocal about like kind of being critical of like the writing of blank checks for Ukraine. And then I think the last thing is like, like what was brought up in terms of like, I feel like the big not blind spot, but the big like vestige, I guess, in even like the quote unquote new conservative movement is that they're very Zionist, very anti-Iran. Like even though Trump's thing where he's like, I'm going to deport all the pro-Hamas supporters on America's college campuses and stuff like that. And so I guess that's kind of my understanding of the current of their agenda and basically where they're trying to move the Republican Party. And I think related to what we've been saying, I think it is very clear that because we're in a moment of crisis and interregnum, where the future is not decided, the Trump movement itself could go in many different directions. It could become, as I think people like Oren Cass wanted to become, it could become basically a new and consistent voting bloc that lasts for a few decades, which is also very similar to kind of past political realignments in America's history. On the other hand, the Trump movement could also basically force through, and I don't know if these are all like mutually exclusive, but the other possibility is that if Trump gets elected, it could force through a very drastic disruption of the functioning of the state and of the bureaucratic apparatus. And basically that could also trigger something like a civil war in which, like if Trump really goes hard after like what they call the deep state, basically like we're going to fire all of the mid-level bureaucrats who fill Washington, D.C. Like, I do think that would have huge political consequences if they actually try to follow through on that. And then I think, like we were saying, the other possibility is for the Maga movement, not in isolation, but as part of a wider kind of political movement to essentially transcend all of that political calculus to reach towards like a higher stage of both political activity, but also consciousness. And I think like Reverend Ike was saying, what is also very clear is that a moment of political realignment means a moment in which the basic terms of politics and ideology become up for grabs. And that's also a moment in which the terms of politics can become the property of the people to decide. And I think this also connects. I was listening to the Ezra Klein's his podcast this morning, where he said, actually, if you talk about polarization in America right now, because he's also recognizing the fact that Trump has made a very deliberate effort to reach out to like Hispanic voters, Black voters, like even union voters. And he's like, actually, in Ezra Klein's words, the primary polarization of American politics right now is not over race, or it's not even in terms of like purely class, but he's like over whether or not you believe that America's institutions are democratic. And Trump represents all of the people in America who no longer believe that these institutions are democratic and basically need to be done away with. Whereas like Biden, or whether it's Biden or Kamala Harris or whatever, that represents that portion of America, which still believes that America's institutions are democratic. And the last thing I'll say is that, yeah, like, I was also talking with Rye about this a few days ago, but yeah, like many people in the MAGA movement itself say what they're after is a revolution. But the question is like, what kind of revolution? What is their frame of reference and chronology for revolution? And for many of them, actually, it is basically 1776, in which you'll also see they use the kind of symbology. And you can also look at that through the lens of like tragedy being farce, where it's like they're taking on like, kind of like the snake symbol of join or die. They take on the kind of mantle of 1776 in a way, which is like, I think it's also, I don't think it's even a bad thing to point out the farce thing, because actually I think part of Trump's political success is that he leans into the farce and he acknowledges it, and he acknowledges himself as an entertainer. And that's actually part of his political power. And obviously I feel like in free school we'd say like the answer is not just 1776, and it's also not like trying to basically achieve like what William McKinley achieved or what Andrew Jackson achieved. But it's actually returned to basically that, like to pick up the mantle of like, the Third American Revolution. But I don't know, I just bring all that up to say that like, I think it's a mistake to kind of just on the one hand, just be like kind of hand wave and be like, oh, all of it's the same old, all of it's just rhetoric and gesturing and none of it is real. When, that's a different question. And I think the other thing is like, I don't feel like it's appropriate to just do this thing also of being like, we only need to talk about it in the sense of like, what would be our role as a political, like new actual vanguard party to like actually speak to the MAGA voters. When I feel like, yeah, like obviously like we're not satisfied with basically like the ideology of someone that's presented by like Oren Cass. I think it's important to like basically try to grapple with like political realignment on the terms of which it's also already happening. Yeah, okay, I know I said a lot. That's kind of like my sense of like, yeah, basically like where this is going, and like if Trump gets elected, especially, this is the attempt to turn MAGA into something like longevity, to achieve basically like a governing philosophy where there's been kind of
So I feel like it's partially like they're trying to make a new Republican Party.
Absolutely.
And one that's not just around Trump as like a figure or Trump as like the man of destiny, but actually like a party, basically. And I feel like it's interesting because that party would take the form or the appearance of like basically rebellion against the established order while trying to create a new order that maybe, like is a party of like working class voters, like diverse people, but is not one where the system itself remains in crisis.
The system itself.
Like it's trying to, I think, save the system from the crisis that it's in a way. Yeah. But I think part of it too is, I think JD Vance and Oren Cass, part of what's interesting is that they're they're very intelligent people. And it's interesting how they're outlining like their views or like their plans or their policies, and even if they're not being totally honest about what it might achieve, it's interesting that they are kind of laying out like a governing or like an economic philosophy that is maybe more logical than like Trump's whims or impulses or instincts. So something that JD Vance I think was a lot about was basically that he wants to bring in like the millions of working men of like prime age who are unemployed and will like never have a job. And like that's sort of the thrust of like why he wants to reindustrialize America, which is interesting.
Can I ask you a question, Nuri or Jerry? Do you feel that this is the end of the neoliberal neocon consensus? Or could be the end?
That's a big one. I hope so. Or,
Yeah.
well, the thing is, I don't think that those are the most compelling categories anymore. Maybe like they feel like they're part of an older age. But that's just my feeling about things because I do think like with JD Vance and Oren Cass, they both feel a little bit more original to me than just like repeating like the neoliberal lines or like the neocon lines. Like there's a little bit more of like an internal logic that they're trying to build where it's not just like the dogma of like, oh, the neoliberal world order says like, of course America should be on top in every single situation. Or like the neocon order, which is like, oh, we have the right to like, I don't know, like do airstrikes anywhere we want. And like we should be like driven by war all the time. And that should be like the basis of our economy. And so I feel like they aren't tethered, I feel like, to those dogmas.
And what about the 2025 project? What is their relationship to that?
Oren Cass actually, Oren Cass was involved in Project 2025. But he was involved in the labor portion, and I remember he was asked about it in an interview, and he was kind of like, yeah, like I was involved. I'm not like proud of it, but like the product was not originally what I intended, and he was kind of hesitating.
It feels like nobody wants to take responsibility for it.
Yeah.
Because it's also the contradiction of like that came out of I think the Heritage, Heritage Foundation. Whereas like Oren Cass, part of the contradiction is like, I mean, this is also like the inter-elite thing, where they're like, Oren Cass represents like he also founded his own think tank thing, and like they're trying to provide like new kind of intellectual and ideological like vanguard, and they're trying to do away with like basically like the legacy think tanks of like Heritage Foundation and all that stuff. But at the same time, like those are also all the people that they know and all the people that they talk to. So yeah.
Can I ask you? I've asked you one other question. What do you all think? You've heard Alexander McCourace's assessment of the selection of J.D. Vance and yada yada yada. What do you think of his assessment of this? Because the question I asked literally comes from him. That the end of a neoliberal neocon.
I think it does in some ways mark the end, but I think there's still a struggle. I think there's still going to be a struggle also even within the Republican Party. Like even if Trump gets elected, I don't think that it just Trump selecting JD Vance represents that like the transformation of the GOP has been complete. And I think, like the Duran guys were speculating about this, but a lot also depends on or it will be indicated by who Trump selects as part of his cabinet positions, and basically whether like Trump is actually serious and like trying to like learn from his quote unquote past mistakes, where he like brought in all these people who were like literally from the swamp, like he was trying to quote unquote drain the swamp, and yeah, but I do think that like to me it does feel very significant that Trump chose JD Vance, and I think that that's basically like Trump's vote of confidence and like what he sees in like the future, first of the Republican Party, but even more so of like his movement. Because I think Trump recognizes that like he can't. I mean, this is part of the dilemma of the MAGA movement itself, which I'm curious about like, how you guys sense it, but I think it is very true. MAGA is dominated by the personality of Donald Trump, and this also kind of feeds the man of destiny thing that we talked about within the Trump movement, where they definitely see him as like a man of destiny. But I think part of what Trump is trying to deal with is like, is there a future for this movement beyond just me? And I think that he's basically trying to make a strategic move of like, I'm going to invest in someone like JD Vance, and what he represents is like the future, and something that can extend beyond just.
Alexander McCurris also said that like Mitch McConnell and all the neocons are now isolated within the Republican Party for the first time, and I guess it is. We're waiting to see what the cabinet picks would be.
I guess one thing I would add that I thought was maybe missing is I read the Ezra Klein interview with him. And when he talks about this issue of like tariffs, raising prices, how that's counterintuitive to their whole plan, he talks about, right, like, no, but I think the American people, especially like the white working class, will make the sacrifice higher prices for that dream of like America first, and that America is like dominating the world. And so I think that's like an important thing for me to be like, oh no, this is the same like white supremacist, imperialist rhetoric and like the doctrine that would be happening. And yeah, whether or not the American people are ready to do that, I think they are. I think it would be fine. I think people are ready to sacrifice to have their dream, their white supremacist dream again. But I think that's also the key aspect that I see.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it's really interesting because, in some ways, what I feel like also, in the Ezra Klein interview with Cass, he keeps pushing him. Klein keeps pushing him. I'm like, oh, is this just a thing for white workers? And Cass keeps being like, no, it's not just a thing for white workers, And you can critique that. You can be like skeptical of it, and I think how they would put it is that it's not they're trying to make it not a race thing, but instead to say that basically American prosperity depends on basically everything being downstream of reindustrialization, and I feel like you can also like debate how much they actually mean that, but I think the interesting thing that I think is part of it is even aside from this question of like specifically inflation, part of what I feel like we like have to think about though is that like if America is actually going to become transformed, the people will have to make certain sacrifices.
Yeah,
yeah.
The left will say,
right,
the environment, we need to degrowth, and that's going to mean that we don't get our dinner on time in 2 days. And that's fine. But like, I think even if Vance and Cass are sincere about like, raising all the American workers, including workers of color, which I don't really believe, but even if they were, I still don't think that America First position will rely on the exploitation of the majority of people of color in the world outside of the US, which, is like not interesting to me as a political position.
Well, I think that this whole question of inflation is important because as we discussed before, the inflation is driven and the power of the dollar is mainly driven by policy. It's a fiat currency. It's not tied to anything. It's not backed by anything. It's not backed by gold. It's backed by the promise that America will pay you back. And it always comes back fastest in a global crisis because that promise, America will, pay you back. But the American bonds have become sort of the driving force for also the American military machine.
Right.
So this question of inflation, which popped up when Jimmy Carter was president, is deeply tied to the American military complex. And sometimes people sort of just jump to it, which I should have done, and said the dollar is represented by American military force in the Middle East and abroad, and it's ironic actually, it's farcical that an explicitly white nationalist section of the country, or explicitly, implicitly, or sort of in the South, something that the civil rights movement changed in America, it became inappropriate publicly to be racist. So sometimes you get Republicans who are like, oh, we're not racist, we have Amber Rose and an Indian woman, and it's just very funny to me, and but the idea that the America First section of American politics is its own undoing of the American world order, whereas I feel like Democrats very implicitly know that what they're defending is the American position in the world. Joe Biden said that in his one of the interviews he did, which was like, "I'm the best hope for America." Whereas all these racists, people from, all these, what's the word? deplorables, all these deplorable people, all these people who say politically incorrect shit, all these, people who, if you look back at 2016, they were talking, Trump was making fun of a disabled reporter, saying grab him by the pussy, and
You didn't have to say it. No, I'm always joking.
forgot we're in a church, although it didn't matter to Reverend Miller. But just to quote what he said, it's ironic that that's what America represents now. It's sort of America's on being undone, ironically, by the people who are like, let's protect America, let's make America great again. And do they realize it? Because I guess that's a question I ask myself. Like, do they realize that they're undoing the American military machine from inside? And then it's this question of Baldwin and the last white nation, or more accurately, probably Du Bois, the wages of whiteness. Like, what does whiteness matter when you don't get paid for it? When material, it doesn't count for a thing, but people still hold on to it. And isn't it ironic that the people undoing, the economic foundation of whiteness, which is the dollar, you have Malcolm X writing his article about dollars. That is how America interacts with the rest of the world, through our relationship. And you always hear about economists. Oh, the American consumer is doing this. Oh, the American consumer has $10,000 in credit card debt, and somehow they're still buying everyone presents for Christmas. And that's how I see Donald Trump as a farcical figure, because he says he appears to be something, but it's the ultimate joke.
Well, just one thing about that, like even in terms of like the whole foreign policy thing, Trump will often, and Vance does this too, often make this move of like whether it's Europe, South Korea, Taiwan need to pay us more. Because basically we're like America is acting as the military insurance for all these countries because we have these military bases. And I feel like there's one way to react to that, which is basically like, oh, like that's so racist, or like that's so like, I don't know, like American exceptionalist. But the other thing is like if Trump gets elected, and like even practically speaking, if he says to like, for instance, South Korea, like I'm gonna make you pay like 10 times more than you,
but we can't.
Yeah, and they say they can't pay. Like, does that mean that the U.S. pulls out of South Korea? Like, I think it's a genuine possibility. And like, does the U.S. pull out of Europe, where basically you have the kind of post-war architecture of like American global power, like Samir was saying, was basically set up on the premise that America would guarantee, quote unquote, the security of the free world by having all these military bases everywhere. And like Samir was saying, like it may be an ironic thing. It may not also be fully consciously recognized by someone like Trump, but like the actual effect would be like, like let's say like U.S. pulling out of South Korea.
But it is. I mean, there's the text and subtext. It's clearly a recognition that the British had to recognize after World War II. The empire is too expensive. It's killing the value of the pound and such. And that's what they're saying. I mean, Trump says it in his way. I'm not going to defend Taiwan. They're rich. They can defend themselves, against China, and I'm not going to defend Europe. It is a recognition that the empire is too expensive. The other thing it recognizes is that the empire has de-developed the nation.
Yeah, right.
And I would say that even though Oren Cass doesn't say it, the economics are the economics of a developing country, which you see what I'm saying? And the model for what they're trying to do is, ironically, China.
Yes. No, it is. Yeah. All the men that are outside of the labor force that need to be given something to do to actually make this country productive.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's the U.S., and they're right about this. The flyover parts of the country are an underdeveloped country, what would you say, a emerging market. So they could say William McKinley or they could say whoever they want. Really, their best model would be Deng Xiaoping.
Yeah. Oh, that's also like part of their.
It's crazy. But can I just say one small other thing? And this, I guess, this adds fuel to your fire, Samir. A farce. I mean, there's certain words they cannot say, but everything says it. And more than anything, the masses of working people will be destroyed by empire. And which means that Cass and J.D. Vance and Trump are trying to save the country from a revolution or a civil war.
Yes.
This, I mean, it makes you want to, jump up and holler, as they say, or clap your hands, because it is a record. And this is what the whole Democratic Party. This is the end of liberalism, the end of democracy, the end of freedom, the end of everything. But they won't admit the end of empire. And Trump is right. We cannot afford to wage war against China, against North Korea for that matter, or Russia. It is just the very opposite of what the mainstream media is propagandizing. And Trump and them are right. And when I read Doodat, when he says, this morning, that Trump, he had a chance, the first part of his speech was all good, and then he fucked up. He went off the rails, But why did he go off the rails? Because then he started talking the language of the disinherited. That's when he went off the rails, and therefore closed the door to a modus operandi, a compromise with the people that brought this disaster, this catastrophe upon the people. That door is closed. I don't think, and by choosing J.D. Vance rather than Marco Rubio or what's that one from South Carolina?
Tim Scott.
No, well, that idiot. But I'm talking about the other one, the warmonger.
Lindsey Graham? Lindsey Graham?
Who?
Lindsey Graham.
Lindsey Graham. By not choosing any of them, he is therefore saying that the door, like Putin is saying, the door to negotiation is closed. We can't, with Zelensky, there's no possibility. And I think could be that turning point in at least the politics of this era.
Wow, so does that mean J.D. Vance is our antithesis?
Say that again.
Does that mean J.D. Vance is our almost like a Una reverse mirror?
I don't know what that, but just say once again.
Well, it's like the part that Jeremiah was saying where it's like J.D. Vance went into like Ivy League university and also was like, wow, this is all fucked up. This is irrational. This is an irrational ruling elite. My solution, I'm gonna save his version. When he says I'm gonna save the country, it means it's like what you said. I'm gonna save the country from revolution/war, which is like I would say I'm trying to save the country or achieve our nation, which means like bring on revolution. Except my definition of revolution is from the Black freedom struggle. Well, because also I bring that up because I'm really intrigued by Usha Vance.
She's from my town.
Yeah, but also because
Really? Did you know her?
She's a little older than me.
Okay.
But I know the high school she went to, and I can understand the kind of she grew up with.
Well, because I first learned about J.D. Vance from my sister. Because some of the think my sister is my Uno reverse. Where like my sister. My sister's my Uno reverse.
What is that?
She's in my reverse.
You're opposite.
Opposite,
Okay.
yeah. In some ways, very so similar and opposite because my sister, like, she reminds me. My sister was the one who introduced me to hillbilly elegy. Because my sister, it blew her mind when she was like, it was almost like she had found her mission in life. Where she was like, she had in some ways gotten fed up with like whiteness, like, but her solution to whiteness was like the poor white. Does that make sense? And so she was like, yeah, like, you should read this book by J.D. Vance. I remember we were like arguing about it in 2017 or something. Because I was like, well, what about the souls of black folk? And yeah, and it's kind of interesting because in some ways, like, my sister and I are so similar. Like, both in some ways had to confront white supremacy and whiteness a certain way, except she went for the poor white and I went for the black worker. Like, it's actually really interesting to me. And I mean, even my sister's husband, who she just got married to, in some ways, his family reminds me a lot of J.D. Vance. Yeah. They're very much like, they're not part, they're like they're very like down to earth, but like, they don't have a concept of, like, their father, her husband's father went to an HBCU.
Yeah.
But like doesn't have a concept of the black worker as like basically a really important force in society. And yeah, it's kind of interesting.
Well, my neighbor was talking to me about Biden, and I said, you might have to change like your sign in your front yard. And she said, oh yeah, well, anyone but Trump. And I was like, well, who is that anyone? Like, if you look at Pete Buttigieg, like, transportation has been a disaster. Like, the bridges have collapsed, airports have been a disaster. You've ridden in an airplane, you hate the Secretary of Transportation. And then she was like,
not even to mention Palestine, Ohio.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. I was thinking about 95 and 95 twice. And then I said, there's Gavin Newsom. And I was like, but to be honest, I pay a lot of attention to politics. I have no idea who Gavin Newsom is. But I told her straight up, I was just like, the people in the Democratic Party are not going to tolerate like someone from California or Shapiro from Pennsylvania. The middle of the country is not just, crucial to this country, but also crucial to the Democratic Party. There has not been a Catholic or Northeastern president who was a Democrat since John F. Kennedy, and he was assassinated. Everybody since then has come from the South, whether it be Lyndon B. Johnson or
Clinton.
Clinton from Arkansas, or
Carter.
Jimmy Carter from Georgia. You can't count out basically like visible America. I think that's what J.D. Vance represents.
Yeah.
And it was sort of, hillbilly elegy. It was sort of a little weird because he was just like, oh, I don't fit in and I have all these microaggressions. Like, come on, dude, you're a Republican. But that's just how dominant postmodernism is. It's even the Republicans need to be like, look, we have a black woman on the stage. Like, look, we have an Indian woman on the stage. And if you, I don't know, this is a side comment, but a lot of Republican senators really like Asian women.
Oh, definitely. And well, I won't go into that.
This is just something that I'm trying to make sense of, but the Make America Great Again platform, I think it's different. Like, I see Trump's version of it different from, say, Vance's version of it. And, I think it's something that's still settling and we find some final form after, I guess, the government is formed and the next 4 years. So that's thinking about India, but, the next 4 years will reveal a lot. But I think the thing that, maybe this is a simple thing, but for me, it's very remarkable that part of Trump's Make America Great Again platform is also a certain distancing from Europe and European allies.
There's no question.
I mean, he talks about the other NATO countries like he talks about any other country.
See, that's the abandonment of the Atlantic Alliance.
Right.
And this is, that's very huge. But it is an Asian focus. That's why it's so interesting, if not intentional. Aisha Vance.
Yeah.
Is that an Indian woman. Well, that's a lot of political capital for the Trump administration. It's very interesting, and it breaks. So if they want, to claim that they're a white supremacist party, what is certain questions to
I
that
guess
now?
the question I have is, has there ever been a time when America or the American empire has been or on the verge of being so separate from the European or, the Western civilization?
Not since World War One, with Wilson taking the United States into the war. Previous to that, the 50 years previously, the only thing was the Civil War. The United States had not fought well, maybe with Mexico in the 1840s, but had never fought a war. The greatest war America ever fought up to this day is the Civil War. And but then after World War II, the United States, through NATO, becomes the guarantor of the Western regimes against communism, but not the Soviet Union, but their own class struggle. Yes, this I think is very, very huge.
And it's a very Baldwinian moment because, he talks about how one of the first things for this country to even achieve itself or become the country that it's still in becoming,
Yes,
is also to separate itself from a conception of civilization or modernity or whatever that's rooted in Europe. But that I'm not claiming that Trump actually places the kernel of truth there, but it might still be a consequence of his formulation.
it has to be considered.
Yeah.
But the thing is, I was talking about the model might be the Deng Xiaoping model. The big difference, this is a guy from here. With China, you have state, party, and civilization. In the United States, you can talk from now on about what you want to do, but the question is who has state power. And certainly, the Republican Party is not the Communist Party of China, which can mobilize, which can do a whole lot of things. So, J.D. Vance and Donald Trump go with at least one arm tied behind their back because the attempted assassination showed him or let him know when that bullet whizzed by his head, you can die.
Yeah.
So this is
Well, it's ironic because everything that they accuse China of doing in terms of trade protectionism is exactly what they want to try to do.
That's what I'm saying. Deng Xiaoping. Say that again.
They're jealous.
Oh, jealousy doesn't even begin to explain because it undermines many of the white supremacist assumptions about the world's people. A white nation is going to be the policeman of the whole world? Not anymore. And Trump is more like Mearsheimer than he is like, whoever, Zbigniew Brzezinski. And this is huge. This is huge. It gives the people a fighting chance. Because,
Okay, maybe we should do comments and then Baldwin. Baldwin.
Things were getting heated in the comments.
Okay. I'm not going to read every single comment.
Yeah, maybe great.
Because
You don't want to do comments? I don't have to.
okay, I'm just gonna summarize. Someone named John, Fireplay, Adwa, Midwest, Nasty, Crystal, Future Homestead, Pod, Farce, Don DeBar. Good morning. Don DeBar just says breaking news. Cynthia McKinney, eyewitness. I don't know what that means. Bambalai 7 says when these leaders use the words good and evil, they release a powerful tool of control. Adwa Medwa Sasi says, over my head, arrow towards it's above me now. Fired Play says, Trump is not being propelled by the working class. That's a lie. And then he says that his comments got removed because he's mentioning Jill Stein. And so he posted it on Twitter and said, I don't have the context for this, but it's the oldest trick in the book, alternative choice. I'm voting for Dr. Jill Stein and encourage others to do the same. And I'm growing food for my community as part of my mutual aid service. And then Todd asks, why are most working people supporting Trump? Fired Play. And there's a discussion about whether or not that's true. BK says the elite ruling class has no allegiance to any political party. That RNC was a complete circus. And Fireplay agrees, saying, yes, it was a room of false prophets celebrating their failures. But Todd says, I'm not so sure. In my experience, a large Irish family, all of the blue collars are following the hope and change game, and that for them is Trump. And then BK said, the current Trump supporter sounds like Biden supporters 4 years ago, in that they feel that once Trump gets elected, so many of the nation's problems will just disappear. Todd says, yeah, I'm not seeing that level of naivete. But BK says that Trump is seen as a savior by the majority of his supporters, who are parentheses sheep, not the minority. Fired Play says the majority of the workers don't support capitalists, regardless of whatever political cloak they wear. And then, it got a little bit ugly. They're calling names.
To set comment guidelines. Yeah. They're getting nasty.
Yeah. There's, bad faith, calling names.
Yeah, they're calling each other names in the comment section.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah, and then let's see. Okay, BK says, for example, Trump says he'll end wars, but look into his relationship with Eric Prince, the founder of the mercenary group Blackwater. All of Trump's positive solutions come with inconvenient caveats. But Jahan said, I think the writing is on the wall for the neoliberal and neocon project. Note that George W. Bush was nowhere to be seen in Milwaukee. Yeah. And then he said, visiting Kentucky, much of it felt like a developing country. They didn't even have proper rest stops where you could get a cup of coffee. Much of the country is like this and left behind. The world has changed so significantly since Trump's first term that he will have to deal with a new world. The willingness to weaken the dollar shows that they're willing to realize this, like basically to be a realist. And then the YouTube name I can't pronounce says that Trump's political principles lie in real estate policy. There should be no tax on tips. Trickle-down economics has reached the point of trying to fund the public budget by expecting windfall profits from tips, at least in rhetoric. And that industrialization was hidden in the Teamsters speech, I think Sean O'Brien at the RNC, and then agrees that, yeah, the Mississippi Basin and the South, along with parts of Appalachia, are extremely hollowed out. And then Todd says, Jahan, wait until you see New Mexico.
Well, the last thing we just wanted to share was, just like last week, the plans for the August event for James Baldwin's birthday are moving along, in that the 3 days, I think, like last time we said, are Friday, August 2nd, which is James Baldwin's official 100th birth anniversary, August 3rd, which is Saturday, and Monday, August 5th. So Friday, August 2nd, James Baldwin's birthday, we will, here at the Church of the Crucifixion from 5 to 8, we will have a documentary screening and a panel discussion on James Baldwin, like officially commemorating his 100th birthday, and talk about James Baldwin, the revolutionary, like not just a cultural radical, but in fact a political revolutionary with an immense contribution to the American revolutionary process. And it'll kind of be based around the documentary that Doc and I are making. And then Saturday, 2 p.m. to 8 p.m., which should be like a surprise, we're not doing an 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. event, but we're doing a 2 to 8 p.m. Afro-Asiatic peace concert here at the Church of the Crucifixion. We're really excited because we finally have a program nailed down, which is, it's going to be divided into 3 sections, which I can read out. The first section is called Take Me to the Water. And in that section, so each section is named after James Baldwin essay. And
first section, Take Me to the Water, will include Bobby Zankel in his Wonderful Warriors of Sound. And well, actually, even before Take Me to the Water, we'll have like kind of like an invocation, an introduction to the whole concert. Why an Afro-Asiatic peace concert? And Zumbi Soweto, who are African drummers, will kind of invoke or acknowledge some sort of period of acknowledgement, invocation of James Baldwin and this vision for peace. And then the first section of the concert will be Take Me to the Water, where Serafina will sing, Osiris Wildfire, who is a really great street performer, will sing and play guitar, folk musician. And then Bobby Zankel and the Wonderful Warriors of Sound will also perform as part of Take Me to the Water. So kind of like that, invoking that feeling. And the second will be Letter from a Region in My Mind. That section will include Korean dancers from Palisades, from around Palisades Park which is in New Jersey, but it's actually really close to New York City. They're traditional Korean performers, and it sounds like they want to do 3 dances, but they're traveling 2 hours away to perform. We got word that the Chinese Opera Society, which is based in Chinatown, they're going to perform, and they're going to perform 2 dances. And that's really meaningful for me because
dances or songs.
So it's dancing and singing.
Oh, okay.
But it's like, yeah, it's basically an art form that tells stories, like civilizational stories. And they're gonna do a ribbon dance, like singing it. It's like where it's a classical dance where the sleeves are long ribbons that have to be moved around. But it means a lot because when I called them, they were like, "You don't have to pay us at all. We want to do it for free." And that meant a lot, especially because like I grew up with my dad singing the revolutionary operas, and then like in my family, because we're from Beijing, and like Chinese opera is also known as Peking opera, even though it actually has its roots across many different regions. My great grandfather was really into Peking opera, and then we'll also have Ramya and traditional Indian dance Bharatiyam. Is that right? Bharatiyam? Oh, okay. Dance. They're going to perform original piece based on Maya Angelou's poem.
I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings.
I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings. And then finally, Sumi Tenuka. Maybe we're still playing around with it, but Sumi Tenuka, great pianist, will perform either with a duet with Bobby Zankel.
A duet.
A duet. Sumi Tenuka and Bobby Zankel will perform a duet as part of this great middle section, Letter from a Region in My Mind. And then finally, the finale will be titled To Crush a Serpent. And we're also really excited that Palestinian singers, like folk traditional Palestinian singers, who also play instruments like the buwa, as well as dancers, a women's dabka group, and then also a Palestinian opera singer will all perform as part of this finale, along with Alfie Pollitt and Jaleel Shaw, who maybe Michelle can talk more about. Alfie Pollitt and Jaleel Shaw will do A Love Supreme, part 1 acknowledgement, and then we'll have a close. So that's the Afro-Asiatic Peace concert. And then the last day will be Monday, August 5th at the Central Branch of the Free Library. Our event, we'll do the official opening of our art exhibit at the Free Library. And the unveiling of the opening will happen in the lobby, where there'll be some performers. I think Zumbi, the drummers, as well as Osiris Wildfire will perform again in the lobby. And they haven't got back to me. Followed by a guided tour of the exhibit that Kathy, Nuri, and Blaze in particular have worked a lot on. It's called Love and Revolution. James Baldwin Speaks to Our Time. So that was just that was a big update.
And Love and Freedom, Love and Revolution.
Maybe Love and Freedom.
Love and Freedom. Yeah.
Well, this came from you. So
I did say Love and Freedom, but I mean.
Okay.
We wrote down both. We decided. Well, there's still time. Oh, let's discuss tomorrow.
Okay.
Okay, well, you let us know because it's on our flyer, so we should just put it. So Parba and I had worked on, actually Jeremiah helped us with it. We worked on a flyer, which we're gonna print copies after. We hope to bring them today, but we didn't have time, so because we finished it late yesterday. So we'll print a bunch of copies to start doing like flyering, using Blaze's wheat pasting techniques across the city.
Yeah. He's gonna teach us how to make wheat.
So good. Literally reading wheat pasting instructions yesterday.
Yeah, so if you're interested in wheat pasting, Blaze will do a training on making it.
Wheat paste is like an eco-friendly like solution to
Yeah, so we'll have those flyers ready once we finalize a few more details, including final exhibit title. And then, yeah, but we have 2 weeks to go. We're also fundraising. So if you're interested in making a contribution to James Baldwin's 100th birthday celebration, there's a GoFundMe that Alice has the link to. You can also put it in the chat, or you can. We accept all forms of payment: cash, Venmo, GoFundMe. I think that's everything for the celebration. And yeah, we're really excited about the performers, and we're gonna do a lot of outreach. And I talked to Valerie West from us yesterday, and she already knew about the free library day of the celebration, but I think she might try to come to the Afro-Asiatic Conference.
Be good if she did an essay in advance, an article in advance.
Okay. Yeah, I can talk to her. It sounded like she wouldn't be able to. She's on vacation.
Okay.
But I'll talk to her again. She said to email her. So
Well, it takes a while to do an article. So if she did one on like the Saturday, then is not going to be.
oh yeah. So I don't know, did I miss anything? Is there anything else you'd like to say? Any questions?
Probably have to rent some chairs. We might need little chairs.
Oh yeah, yeah. We'll look into it. We'll look into that. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you to all our listeners. Thanks to our listeners, and we'll see you. I think we'll see you next week. We have to determine location. Because the free school, the church is occupied next Saturday.
We're gonna do it. We said we might do it on Sunday.
I think Parva should talk. We would talk about it. Let's talk about it offline. That's a very work thing to say. So, okay. Bye, everyone.